This is the conference, The New Old Wars. Sorry for the Zoom format, but it has its advantages that we can actually relatively easy gather all these people who are in different places of the planet, and you are in different places of the planet. We all, of course, are aware and are following the tragic events that are happening in the former Soviet Union in between Russia and Ukraine. And some of us, those who are from the region, have been particularly shocked and had to make our life choices. It was really a world scale event, but not only for us. But that apart from the immediate like anxiety and anger that these causes in us, we we the intellectuals should also take our distances and understand what's going on. What will this event look like when hopefully it's over, or at least somehow stabilized? What kind of event that is? Again, this was a shocking event. It was rarely predicted as such, and we haven't seen wars on this scale for a while. Again, particularly in our region, there were wars, but the region was relatively quiet for a long period of time. I would say since the Second World War. There are obvious rhymes with the Second World War in what is happening now. The region had not lived through a large-scale war since then. Partly because people still had memory of the Second World War, didn't want to repeat it, and now one of the slogans of the Russian right is like, "We can repeat this." Now they want to repeat. So it's a little bit like this, reconstruction movement. Those who replay Napoleonic Wars. There is a touch, at least in the popular attitude to this war, there is a little bit of this. However, we invited several people who have written on wars, not from the point of view of like military strategy, but from the point of view of social sciences, of philosophy. What are these wars? And as you know, there has been a trend from the left, from the liberal side, to say that the status of war has changed. We have observed many wars in the last decades, but they were mostly asymmetrical. And Michael Hart, present here, rightly wrote that these are kind of new civil wars, because the world is so united that it is hard to say that these are two different camps, two traditional states with armies that clash, but it is rather some very blurred, interwoven society that fights within itself. And indeed, the wars often looked like police operations against some various forms of partisans, and the partisans often retreated to the terrorist tactic, understandably, I must say, because they are partisans. And the discourse in the hegemonic media was that these are some kind of rogue states or rogue groups who do this because they use these brutal tactics. Now, what we see with Russia and Ukraine is that this this looks like an old style war. There are tank armies clashing on both sides. They are functional states with standing armies, professional armies, the tactic is in many ways that of the trench warfare, reminding even maybe rather of the First World War than of the Second World War. As you know, First World War and Second World War are in a sense they are one event. So this made an impression that somehow history is back, and there was a short moment of confusion, and now okay, back into the 20th century. Again, one of the questions is if this is due to the crazy will of Putin, or if this is some kind of objective tendency that we will witness again and again. But what strikes me is that at the same time, there are many elements of these new wars that are incorporated into this war. For example, the Russian side is often behaving like the so-called rogue states. As you know about the several episodes of extreme brutality on the part of the Russian troops, and it looks like maybe it is deliberate. The attitude in the world towards the Russian behavior is also that of the rogue state. So in a way, structurally, maybe there is not. This is not so new with regard to the last decade. Again, a rogue state, but it's just a very big rogue state. And that, of course, has to do with the cultural and political structure of international relations in the last decades. It keeps reproducing itself. Yeah, but so in the Russian-Ukrainian wars, I mentioned the brutality, but there are also drones that had originally been invented for these kind of semi-police operations or punitive operations, but now both sides are using it. Both sides are prosecuting the soldiers of the other side on legal grounds. They think they're criminals. There are many criminal cases open in both in Ukraine and in Russia. So that's kind of weird. If you are in the battlefield, then these are your enemies, not your like criminal offenders. And of course, also for Russia, Ukraine, it is this kind of a civil war in the sense that the sides are so culturally similar. They are post-Soviet republics, so they share a lot of culture. In many cases, they share the language because Ukraine, in a large part, is bilingual or Russophone. In this sense, yeah, it is different from the First and Second World Wars. It is closer to the Civil War. And yeah, and of course the tactic has changed because there are these small groups, diversion groups that operate in the battlefield very often. Not only the large units, but small units are very efficient. So again, some kind of semi-partisan tactic is involved, even though there are also large-scale army operations like crossing the river and whatnot. So these are some preliminary thoughts I have, and that we in this group we if we don't understand what's going on, then who does? Yeah, it's not about myself, obviously, but about my honored colleagues here. And you have the program. The program is on the website. I'm sorry, I heard there were some troubles with the link, but I understand that eventually it works. So sorry about that. And we will start with the talk by Raul Sanchez Cedillo. We will talk for 15-20 minutes each, and then you will be able to ask questions. To ask questions, raise your hand. Raise your hand in the Zoom, and we will give you the floor. Just a moment. Yeah. So Raul Sanchez Cedillo, who He's a Spanish intellectual and a very important person in this meeting, because he actually is one of the first people who published a book on the events. It's an excellent book. Considers this war from all the sides. It's very critical, and I'm sure that Raul will spell out his main ideas and findings here. You're welcome, Raul.
Right, thank you, Artemi. Thank you to all of you present and the co-panelists. I have to be brief. I had to just schematically outline how I see this situation, this war, a year after, on the basis of what I have written in the book that was published last November. So that's the date. I mean the information available on which the book is written. But a year after, I still have to say that not much of what I have written has changed. A year after, we're apparently waiting for a Russian offensive, hence a recruited sense of the conflict. No signs of a truce agreement or whatever. So I still think that, like the book is titled, "This War Doesn't End in Ukraine." Let me recap briefly the main arguments of the book. I think this war, and I'm not the only one, of course, thinking this way, has three main dimensions that are interwoven and are so complex that you cannot consider this war just on the basis of one of them. Of course, first, the main phenomenon, of course, is the main narrative that is operating on the media and both in the Western and Russian and Southern, we should say, media landscape, is the national liberation war, or else the aggression. It's an aggression war. From that point of view, it should be considered as a violation of the United Nations Charter, which would mean that, of course, the Kremlin, Russia, has committed a crime, an international crime against international law. And hence, this is a just war on the side of the Ukrainians. Nobody can deny this fact from the point of view of international law. But I think that this national aspect doesn't, or the specific relationship between the Ukrainian state and Russia, mostly after the 1991 independence, but also if we consider it on the long, in the long term of Ukrainian, we must say, tragedy and terrible history of as a nation building process, as a always divided nation, we have to think that this is not enough, because precisely because of this tragic history of the Ukrainian aspiration, impossible aspiration to a nation state character, like let's say the likes of the main European states, colonial states, and so has always been impossible. And of course, recently we may say that that's been due to Russian interference. But if we look at the Ukrainian history, and of course I'm not an expert, many of you know much more than myself about this, but just a light study of the question shows that the reasons are really into the very Ukrainian history, as that because of the heterogeneity, because of the geopolitical situation, because of the whole chain of events that leads us to the next dimension that is absolutely key if we attend to the recent Ukrainian history, which is that this is also an inter-imperialist conflict. Ukraine is to be considered, so to say, as a pivot state in which interests, of course, in relationship, in alliances with different parts of the Ukrainian oligarchy and social sectors and classes in the Ukrainian society, but two main imperialist blocs. And there we must say that with Putin, gradually Russia redresses or reformulates an imperial design or an aspiration, as I write in the book on the basis of Wallerstein, Verlugian, and Kagalitsky, an attempt to get out of the semi-periphery of the world system and to recreate the traditional sphere of influence and intervention against the Atlantic European bloc that since the very end of the Soviet Union, which means the shock therapy and the whole post-Soviet space as a terrain, as a land for new accumulation and new expansion of capital and power by the Atlantic NATO European Union bloc. This is something that may clearly be proven, is absolutely key to understand the Ukrainian society's evolution, and is absolutely key to understand the push to war from mainly from 2004 and of course after the Maidan. But this is not enough in the sense that if we want to understand, for instance, the interest of the US and the way this has turned into a civilizational war on the part of the European Union. We can see that in the speeches and discourses of main European leaders. President von der Leyen is absolutely clear about this. What is at stake is civilization. And civilization means liberal democracy, means ecological transition, means the defense of minorities, and so on. So there is this civilizational aspect in this war. The same may be said about the Washington's approach to it. And I think this is to be explained by the, so to say, systemic dimension of this war, in the sense that at stake is the conservation, reinforcement, or demise of the US hegemony as the main hegemon in the world system, of course, against China. This is not a secret. This is something that is already written in the in the NATO strategic statements, in the new national security doctrine of the US, and so on. And it's plain to be read in, of course, European Commission speeches and so on. It's also a civilizational war against China. So these whole dimensions, three dimensions, make impossible to address this war from the point of view of just any violation of international right. It has this aspect that I term as a tipping point of the Capitalocene, in the sense that the tensions inside the world system that have been accumulating for so many years have reached a tipping point. And so to say, the main process that comes out of it is this war in Ukraine that is accompanied until now by a sort of new Cold War, civilizational Cold War between the Western alliances and the rest of the world, actually, with different degrees. But at the same time, and I go back here to Arrighi and Silver in their chaos and order in the world system, this is absolutely determined by what I would term changing a little bit their phrasing as an ecosystemic chaos, because of course the processes leading to this situation are plain to see: climate change, global inequality, of course, the COVID pandemic and the results of it, the need to address the social unrest, the social distraction that these processes have created across the world. So if we wonder ourselves why now, it's just because Putin, we must say, of course not. It's because war, as this kind of war and its corresponding war regimes, are the response that attempts to kind of govern or create trends or attract us, so to say, in this ecosystemic chaos. Of course, power attracts us, hierarchy attracts us, and so on. This means that there is no traditional, as Artemi was speaking at the beginning, in terms of asymmetric wars that may end by negotiation or by some kind of agreement. There might be those kinds of agreement, but I think that they are not to last if these conditions are still are still present. The conditions I'm describing. The bet for war, this civilizational war on the part of the Western world, the Atlantic European colonial states, is of course being combated on the lives of the Ukrainian people, and the people actually being combating in this war and being victims of it. Refugees, asylum seekers, minorities, and so on. And it's something that is clear to me, because the main goal of the Western powers, with many divisions that we may discuss later, but it would take too much time on my part to go into detail about this. The main goal of these powers is is an attrition war on the Russian government and state in order to weaken it, and it is of course an isolation and an attrition war with China that is going on a crescendo. But about this war regime and the goals of these war regimes, of course, it has to do with tightening the social processes, tightening social struggles, tightening the abilities of Western liberal democracies to become conflictual in terms of class struggle, in terms of destitution of the ruling elites, capitalistic elites. This has to be avoided, and we are witnessing now the way, for instance, climate protests or labor protests like in France and UK are being met with strong criminalization and strong repression, because of course they are non-controllable variables into this process. We are already seeing the contradictions, as I was saying, between the USA and the European Union about the energy crisis, inflation, and so on. Currently, the US power on the process from the financial and energy point of view is being reinforced. We are seeing this with the enormous capacity of determining the energy supplies by the US. That has led Bruno Le Maire and Habeck to go to Washington to say what is going on here. The European summit, the European Union summit is discussing this, how to respond to this neo-protectionist stance by the US government with the Inflation Reduction Act and so on. But from the collective point of view, from the Western point of view, the main goal of this process is, of course, about preserving the financial, technological, racial hierarchies, the demographic issue, to deal with it in a neo-colonial way, but no clear solutions are still at hand. And this process, and I'm finishing, sheds a new light on the crisis of global capitalism from the Western point of view. And I think that we are heading, regardless of the evolution of this war, that of course may be totally catastrophic, maybe even, of course, not likely, but the probability of exists and varies according to the events of a nuclear catastrophe and so on. But from the point of view of the capitalist accumulation regimes, we are seeing that the whole process that we're under discussion, climate transition or energy transition, green pacts and so on, global inequality, tech supremacy and so on, the crisis of multilateralism. So I think that they are absolutely encapsulated, reformatted by this war regime aspects. So this sheds a new light, for instance, on the wealth distribution, redistribution, and we see that it is determined, of course, by this war regime and friend and foe relationship. So it is war wealth distribution. We also see that parts of the social democratic left and the Greens in the Western world are coping with this situation in terms of, okay, let's have a war social democracy, like, for instance, Adam Tooze and others have already spoken of as a possibility of having a center-left progressive redistributional version of this civilizational war. But also multilateralism is reformatted on the basis of this friend and foe about this conflict. Growth regimes are completely determined by the energy transition that is completely determined by war objectives and war goals. And the same could be said of migration and transcontinental mobility. We see that in Africa, for instance, migrations have become, for all the actors, a war item. Human mobility is considered as a possible weapon, as a possible threat, and is treated like that. The masses of human people, human and peoples migrating to the north or even between countries in Africa are considered as a threat, as a possible instrumentalization by China, Russia, and so on. We are witnessing the doubling and the increase of war spending because, of course, of the war, but also as a way of channeling the enormous financial effort that was already after the pandemic with the new the next generation plan in the European Union, the Build Better Act that has turned into a very protectionist Inflation Reduction Act in the US with much less financial effort, by the way. We are now seeing that with this conflict between the US and the European Union about energy and so on and protectionism, the European Union is betting on more protectionism, more financial spending effort that is completely related to this war regime growth process. and so on. So I think that, and I'm finishing, these are processes that cannot be stopped, if not by the things that have already stopped capitalist war, which is class struggle, intersectional, anti-capitalist mobilization and effort, but not. And we may discuss this, but I'm not very optimistic about the possible reformist dialectic inside liberal democracies. I'm much more pessimistic about Russia, of course, because of the conditions of autocracy and authoritarianism. But I think that this is a very solid bet on the part of the capitalist elite. And I think that we must, so to say, get ready for a long period, or not, maybe not so long, but a long period of accumulation of protests and forces. But the goal has to be, let's say, kind of revolutionary. We have to really put these governments into crisis, and we have to be able to create an alliance and a project that I termed as constituent peace, relating the end the war now with the end of capitalism, hegemony in society. And this is talking about revolution for the 21st century. I leave it there. Sorry, I took 20 minutes, but thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Raul. Any immediate reactions? You have to raise your hand if you are not a co-host, and we will see it if you want to say something. If for some reason this doesn't work, this digital hand raising, you can just turn on your video and wave your hand. In the interim, I will just say one word, that all of this civilization theory was considered, like, if you take 20 years ago, we were all very suspicious about it. I mean, there was Huntington, who was so popular. Actually, he was popular in Russia because people did speak this civilization lingo there in the academia, the right-wing part of the academia. And we, the left, were saying, oh, Huntington, ha ha ha, because there are Huntington hypostasizes civilizations, and Russia, from the prima facie, it's not a different civilization than Europe. I mean, come on, it's been so modernized and cultured in the 20th century by the Soviet Union, that really, I mean, it's not that different. What kind of civilization? But because Huntington, of course, insists that it is post-Orthodox. But you are right, indeed, that now we witness Huntington becoming true, or Wallerstein becoming true. Like, this is something more dignified. But Wallerstein was also criticized for the same reasons.
You want me to say something about that?
If you want, no, you can just treat it as a comment. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, of course. This is, I mean, this is, it was a point of view of the reactionary colonial theorists like Huntington, that has had his correspondence with people like, I mean, Dugin or others in Russia. And of course, we know that Putin refers to Ivan Ilyin and those kinds of fascist or strong reactionary religious civilizational theorists. And I think that it has to do with the shift in the theories of globalization and global order that has been preparing for this, of course. But we have to take also into account the liberal version of it, civilizational war, that is an attempt, from my point of view, by the leading forces of the capitalist globalization since the 90s. I mean, with Clinton and Blair and others and of course also the most of the governments in the European Union since then until the 2008 crisis, they have promoted this liberal um, project as a way of extending a non-identitarian, a non-hard concept of civilization, but rather a consensual, democratic, etc., pluralistic version of it. Of course, we now know that, that's bullshit in the sense that it has to do with the of course with the maintenance of a certain regime of wealth production and redistribution that has been, in the case of Europe, that I know better, that is at the basis of the foundation of the European Union and the European social model that has been completely almost transfigured and degraded from Maastricht and Amsterdam on until now, but it's based, as we know, on two pillars. Of course, the relationship between Germany and France, on the one hand, but also from the point of view of the political forces, on the alliance between the Popular Party and the European Socialist Party, the Social Democrats, no? And they are struggling now to maintain that hegemony. So when they speak of civilization, they speak of that kind of pluralistic system and this oscillation between, capitalist financial accumulation and trickle down redistributional policies since Blair on, and of course Zapatero, for instance, in Spain, it was more or less the same, but with a strong emphasis on civic, on civil rights and so on, with the gay marriage law, and this was 2004. And the current government in Spain is more or less the same. They are having a redistributional effort, also because Podemos is in the government, but they are not questioning what Daniela Gabor and others call the macro-financial design of in the European Union. So they are at crisis because after the pandemic, the dangers were, of course, on the one hand, the extreme right that is already destroying the Popular Party. We are seeing new kind of negotiation and alliances between the conservative European group, where Meloni and others are, and the identitarians of Salvini and others that are already getting their license to operate. They are getting citizenship rights, so to say, in the European government, as long as they consent and they abide by the civilizational war effort. And we see that Meloni is absolutely Atlantis, the fascist party, Italian social movement that is the matrix of Meloni's party has always been pro-NATO, and was part of the NATO operations in Italy with a stay behind and Gladio and staff, in the sense of avoiding any communist or anti-NATO insurrection and so on. So this one of the effects of this push for war, more or less paradoxically, is that there is a process inside the right towards a kind of fusion with several alternatives, neo-sovereignists or just fascist and anti-Russian fascist and conservatives or liberal conservatives. This is happening. We see it in Poland. We see it inside the Visegrad group, and we see it in Italy, and we are also witnessing it in Spain, in the sense that Vox, for instance, that had a flirt with Russian money and so on, now is adapting, steering the direction towards a full commitment to NATO and so on. So this is an attempt, this civilizational discourse that is, and I'm finishing, it will be a victim of its own contradictions, because the main enemy here, as we see, is of course pro-Russian sovereignty, but I don't see much of it now in Western Europe. I see it rather in the South. And of course, the possibility of social revolt, which is the main, so to say, enemy, the main foe, the Gespenst, you know, the ghost of communism in this situation.
Yeah, the social revolt is now called populism. And there is increasingly this kind of very abstract opposition between civilization and populism. Here, I agree with you. I think Ari wanted to say something. You do? Yeah. Okay. I'm turning you on. No, you don't have a question. Okay, because you raised your hand. And there is a question in chat from Chris James Newlove. What possible strategies for the movements can we use to help initiate a movement that is neither pro-Russia nor pro-Western empire? Well, that's a million-dollar question. I don't know. Do you have something to comment?
I've written in the book that I think that we have to link, because there is an absolute need in order to sabotage, to stop this process, to push for an end or a truce in this war, because it's the only way that both in Russia, Ukraine, and Western Europe and everywhere, there could be a reorganization of forces against this whole design. I mean, for social justice, for social climate transition, for democratization, and so on. So pacifism is not enough, but at the same time, if we don't talk about this war, climate action, social redistribution, energy transition, and the new hierarchies, migration flows, and the militarization of borders and so on cannot be addressed, because the war discourse and the war regime will always have a say, will always have this pretext of going on. So that's why I speak of constituent peace. It's about, I'm speaking of a refoundation of the left as an emancipatory anti-war left. We were speaking a year ago of Zimmerwald, the Zimmerwald conference in 1915. Is it exaggerated? Is it not really fitting in with the situation? I think it's a reference, because I think that every day that passes, we are more into that kind of situation. The necessity of reconstructing a revolutionary transnational perspective on this problem.
Yeah, by the end, you see the question made you say the most important thing, you know, the constituent piece. I think it's a very potent formula. Then we with colleagues, we also are thinking about this as a reconstitution. There's certainly some kind of a constituent moment, hopefully, on the positive side. Okay, that's great. Now the floor goes to Michael Hart, who doesn't need introduction, but he is a professor at the Duke University, and he will speak on war among nations.
Thanks, Artemi. Thanks for organizing it. I in many ways, I think I'll end up overlapping with what Raul had to say. You know, one thing I guess I wanted to say first is it's not yet clear to me how to understand this war properly and in what framework to do it. And so what I've really prepared are negative questions, in some ways, the ways in which I want to avoid dressing new phenomena in old clothes. But I'll come to that in a minute. And those are the things that overlap with Raul's. I wanted to start actually with two laments that are not really conceptual in this way. My first lament is about the growing militarism in the United States and of course elsewhere, which overlaps strongly with what Raul calls in his book this régimen de guerra, a war regime. I'm thinking not only of increased military spending, although of course this is remarkable, and seemingly unquestioned rise in the production of weapons, and also the distribution of weapons. I mean, think about the pressures on Germany regarding tanks in the recent days. But I'm also thinking, in addition to all of that, let's say material aspects, I'm also thinking about the militarism in its ideological and social forms, by which I mean an affirmation of military values throughout society, an acceptance of the central role of the military, or even an acceptance of war as a constant practice and ineluctable political tool. This I see particularly in the US, and I imagine that in Europe it's even more pronounced, this this rising militarism. I'm posing it as a lament because I guess I don't have a direct way of attacking it, but I just wanted to start by posing it. And then the second lament, which is strictly tied to it and close to what Raul said, which is, I have since, for the last year, I've been not exactly puzzled, but troubled by the absolute inability in the US to mount an anti-war movement. We had, of course, think about the previous, although perhaps, in many ways not analogous wars, but just for a reference point, back to February 15th, 2003, when in cities throughout the world, there was an enormous outpouring in the streets against the war. I feel like perhaps because of the inability to comprehend this war, there is that incapacity to mount a large anti-war movement. But I guess I'm posing those first two laments. They're, if anyone were to be able to, as our discussion goes on, fill this out and help me, I'm posing them as things I was going to say I don't understand. It's partly that I understand, but I don't understand how to address. That's maybe the way it goes. This rising militarism and the inability to mount an anti-war movement, even as Raul said, to demand a truce, as a first moment. Okay, so let me go then to, I want to interrogate two frameworks for understanding the war. Artemi mentioned the beginning, and they overlap in certain ways with Raul's three main dimensions that he began with. Understanding this as a war between nation states is one framework, and the other is the return to or construction of a new Cold War. I wanted to just talk about those briefly. Both of these represent phenomena and frameworks that I had thought were definitively in the past. So maybe you could look at my attempts here as a kind of effort in self-criticism. Although, because 20 years ago, I thought we weren't more going to face wars in the what I think of as the 19th century style, war between sovereign nation states. That's what war meant. Or the 20th century Cold War of alliances and frameworks. I say, maybe I'm disingenuous when I say effort at self-criticism, because maybe I'm not very good at self-criticism, and I always come back stubbornly to my own position. So but I do want to think through these because I do find them challenging and useful. I do, though, what's more to the point, or where I come at the end. Again, I'm overlapping with Raul, but I'm going to stop saying that because I'm overlapping in too many ways with Raul, is to regard these frameworks that I see the most widespread today as symptoms. I mean, I think that's the better way of thinking about it, is what are they symptoms of? And that would be the pose of an hypothesis for discussion. Okay, so let me start with just that, and maybe it's too easy, well, except it's true in certain respects. The notion that what we are seeing here is a war between single sovereign nation states, like I said, in a certain 19th century style. And in certain respects, of course, this is certainly true. You know, that this is a war between Russia and Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukrainian sovereignty and defense. We have two armies with soldiers from each nation, plus, of course, mercenaries of various sorts. But then it's not difficult when one looks at the arms, at the financing of the wars, that all of Europe is directly involved, and of course, much beyond that. When it gets repeated that Ukraine is not alone, it's indication of this, that it's not, that we can't understand this simply as a militarized conflict between sovereign states, but rather have to think about it in a larger frame. I mean, I was trying to think, would it make sense to think, you know, the secondary way of thinking about that is the same way that North and South Vietnam were not two sovereign states, or even it wasn't even a civil war, but rather a symptom of a larger conflict. I mean, that could lead us then to thinking about this as a new Cold War. As Raul said, there are often references to World War I as the framework for understanding this, and that's true. I'm more interested in the evocations of the Cold War, which is similar or an extension of that, I'd say. I mean, just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, if it isn't already resonant, I mean, it's constantly constructed as East versus West, the free world, etc. Also, rebirth of U.S. imperialism. I see reading this as in that frame as also a resurrection of certain Cold War phenomena. So there are a couple anomalous manifestations of this that just ought to be puzzling. I mean, for instance, in the United States, the right, there's a strong right-wing presence that has transferred its decades-long anti-communism to an anti-Russia, which is interesting. You know, in their framework, this is the resurrection of the Cold War, and like I say, their Cold War against the Soviet Union is now just a Cold War against Putin's Russia. You know, which is very curious because it makes it seem like they were really never anti-communist in the first place. You know, like the communism drops out and they're still anti-Russia. What they were really is anti-Russia, it seems like, from this ability to immediately transfer a new Cold War into this framework. And I would say that there's a parallel phenomenon on the other side, as best I understand it, that in some way Putin has transferred the Soviet project into, as if it were always just a project of the greater Russia, as if it were always, and so I would say that in some ways for Putin's propaganda, as best I understand it, because I'm you know, of course, I'm very outside of this, and I don't even read Russian, that his framework and affirmation of the entire Soviet period cancels out the entire socialist aspect of the project and maintains it as I mean, even the celebration of Stalingrad victory, you know, the other day seemed to feed directly into that. So I think that this resurrection of the Cold War, I guess I would want to, it doesn't seem to me I guess there would be a third one at least that Artemi added to this at the beginning is the framework of the rogue state. You know, thinking about the post-Cold War framework that we had with Iraq, especially, or Iraq, Afghanistan, the notion that these are rogue states against which the entire globe needs to organize. I think that's an interesting, I hadn't thought of that before you brought it up earlier, Artemi, but that's another interesting one. I think that all of these, like I said, are not helpful frameworks for understanding the current conflict. Yeah, like I said, the metaphor that recurs for me is the one from the 18th Brumaire about dressing old, dressing new phenomena in the clothes of older conflicts, and of course what we miss by that. I guess I should put it in. I'm not saying though that. I'm not saying that, for instance, my understanding is Putin and his allies don't have this ambition. I think they certainly do. I would also say that the interests of the US government, as I understand it, because it's complicated, or rather, I think that it's true that there are many within the US government that see this war as an opportunity for regaining the lost hegemony of the US over global region. That this is an opportunity of regaining hegemony over Europe, of regaining the US's global dominant position, etc. I think that they're both of those projects are equally destined to fail, and so that's why I don't think that it's partly in that reason that I think that this framework of a new Cold War that's combined with, I guess, or allied to a framework that would think of this as in terms of the relations of U.S. imperialism. I think that they're not adequate for this. So then what I would really have to do, but as you can tell, by this time, a year after the war, I'm still not in the position to do it, would be to propose a positive framework of this, a standpoint from the global system about, I mean, Raul was pointing out, thinking of this in terms of this war is an attempt to address the chaos in the global system by those who need to maintain the social and political hierarchies. It's something like that I think one would have to work out, rather than, like I'm saying, and sort of and cleanse our perspective of these older frameworks, which I think don't work. So I guess there are two ways I'm proposing one could go about this. The first, which is probably not my specialty, which would be to look at these ideological formations, what I'm calling these inadequate frameworks, and ask what are they the symptom of? What are the both desires and anxieties of the established powers that they're symptoms of? The second, this is where I should be something I should be able to do, would be to propose a substantially different framework that this war, that would be the adequate way of framing this war. So maybe if you've listened to me up till now, you just say, well, Mike, that's what you should have done all along and you should just shut up now. And so, because I don't have that, I wish I had that. Maybe that I will, as we continue to talk. I'm only yet at the point, I think, of refusing what seem to be inadequate formulations. So I stop there. Artemi.
Thank you, Michael. Are there any reactions?
May I
Questions?
offer a reaction?
Sure. Yeah, we are listening.
Okay. Yeah. So I am using a little bit of time here, even though I'm scheduled to talk a little later, but I'm not going to be talking specifically about this matter. So I think this is a place. In 2019, with my colleague Nick Derwisford, we wrote a book which is called Cyber War and Revolution, in which we actually very much engaged with Michael's theory of empire and other works, in which we partly agreed or disagreed, actually, in order to seek for new conceptualizations and models for understanding new ways of militarization, which were, of course, our major question. So for that, we already were looking at the series of popular mobilizations, and specifically the events in Ukraine in 2014, which kind of like actually sparkled our research. But then it was clear that project kind of growing and becoming bigger and bigger, and it does have certain planetary dimension. So that's how it grew into a kind of a bigger theory of cyber war. And when we say cyber war, we were basically taking this notion from the military and security specialists and giving it a political economic reading, applying basically two frameworks, we could say, like Marxist and Lacanian. So we did think about political economy, we did think about class struggle, and cyber war for us was a very much class struggle event, but at the same time, we were thinking about subjectivities and desires and imaginaries. So there is a lot to talk about here, but specifically one of the moments where kind of triggered my comment was that Michael brought up the new Cold War thing, right? So one of the ways how we looked at the new Cold War in that project was about its kind of like certain deception level. So it seemed to us it has to do a lot with a certain imaginary and how well this imaginary played into the discourse of militarization. While of course, at the same time, we are looking at a situation when old systems participate in one market economy in a certain way. So therefore, with this core opposition at play in the Cold War was the kind of not there at the same time, but the discourse was literally militarized and automated to the extent unimaginable. But then also what's also important here, which again conflicts with entire Cold War model, is that we are not, and this is a core moment for our understanding of new militarisms and how they merge into this global cyber war, is that we are not talking about states as main actors, we think. We are actually seeing a much more complex event where like global corporations act as states. And specifically, we looked at media corporations, but now in the context of the fossil fuel war, we should be looking at many energy corporations and whatnot, right? So, and here we see a much more complex design of huge actors and small actors, corporate actors, state actors acting like corporate actors, and corporate actors acting like state actors. And there are also random events and smaller actors, leaks and hacks and etc. that are also exploited and participating there. So, and final moment that kind of was interesting and important for us when we spoke about cyber war as a model for thinking what we thought 5 years ago, upcoming war, is that even though cyber is in the core of the title, what we really emphasized the mix of cyber and kinetic. Right? So with this physicality and materiality of these new wars is incredibly important. And we, like in 2018 and 19, when we were writing this book, that was already very clear to us, but again, it wouldn't occur to us then to what intensity this kind of mix of cyber and kinetic can actually, you know, how it may happen, how it can come forward eventually. So I think at least these aspects of the cyber war model, with its key goal of redistribution of power, definitely in a more kind of like topological planetary way, but as it happens in topology, with this random kind of almost emphasis on a certain locality and the eventual breaking through at certain local things. And what we also know from even autonomous Marxists, how the importance of these local struggles and how to approach them and how to enter the discussion by looking by them, and how to, while we always want to take distance, actually know how to kill the distance and how to approach certain big events through a certain window, which we are given in the most dramatic circumstances now. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, oh, this was a comment that Svetlana will also have a chance to continue during your her talk. Arseny raised his hand.
Yeah, thank you, Artem. But I'm sorry, but Artem, it's like up to you. If you think that we're getting out of schedule, maybe it's better to
No,
take a
I have
question
my
from chat.
those
or
who know
from
me
Ari.
though know that I am always very lax on time, which we might have to pay at the end, but so
Okay.
far I think we are good. So just keep your comments short.
Yeah, that will be a question or rather a comment. So I just wanted to react to the one thesis that appeared in the beginning of Michael's talk, and so I wanted to return to that and ask. Could you say a few words more about what do you mean, or what do you think about the inability to comprehend the war by broad publicity? If that leads to limited anti-war movements or rally, and maybe this is more valuable to have all these people engaged in different volunteer organizations or projects that work right now in Ukraine itself, in Europe, or even in Russia. So it looks like people are acting more and helping more rather than just raising their voice and participating in street actions.
Do you want to comment, Michael?
Just to, yeah, I should be very brief, but I do think, and this is part of the consequence of the, I think the difficulty of framing the war is, one of the consequences is, like you were suggesting, the inability to construct a project for peace. Let's put it that way, or construct a project against the war. I mean, I agree with you, Arseny, and maybe this is that there are many practical projects of aid, you know, also of humanitarian aid, which I assume what you mean, which rather than sending tanks and such. But that's not yet what I'm more interested in is being able to oppose the war regime itself, you know, to oppose and to be able to struggle for peace. You know, for instance, in the US, and I'm saying now, not speaking about activist groups, but about the general public, there's in all parts of the country, it seems there people are flying Ukrainian flags, and there's a kind of support of Ukraine, which sometimes takes the position of anti-war, but often takes the position of victory against Russia. That seems to be the successful ideological position, rather than, you know, something distinct, which I'm asking for, which is even not as developed as what Raul is, when Raul was talking about constituent peace. I'm even just thinking a movement for the cessation of hostilities, which we have decades long of tradition of such movements, of broad coalition movements against the wars going back at least 50 years, at least. But now it seems to be there's a complete inability of formulating that. I'm speaking just about the US. I know how in many European countries it's similar with some nuances. But anyway, I don't know. I hope that's clear, Arseny, that yeah, anyway, I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And Ari, you want to say something?
Yeah, I read this book which really influenced me, called The Persistence of the Old Regime, a famous book by Meyer, that it's a book that argues against Marx, that once the bourgeoisie becomes strong, everything is about them, and essentially sees that the First World War, its origins have to do with the old regime, with the strength of the nobility that still exists. And I really, I think it's interesting that we should think, so two things I want to say. First, that the three frameworks that we are unsatisfied with are probably the frameworks that the agents who are finding this work are thinking through. So this is like maybe like the nobility, they have not finally, these frameworks are going to generate their poison longer than we expect them to generate their poison, like a lot of things that are disgusting and residual and continue on and on. The second thing that I was thinking about was the concept of uneven development. Maybe we could use it somehow here. Regarding this war, there's obviously something new that we can't conceptualize, but something old at the same time going on. And the third, I don't know if it's not like a theoretical comment, and I don't know if it might sound very unpopular, but people are mobilized toward a resistance of an aggressor in a regime that it's not like, or at least I don't know what Putin plans to do with Ukraine, but I don't think it's probably like, let's say, Israel and Palestine, that he plans on displacing populations and ethnic cleansing. Probably there is a puppet regime that he wants to install in Ukraine, and of course that's very bad. But is the war, is resistance worth it in terms of the other regime that will be installed? Is this a war you would fight? Let's say, I'm thinking about myself. Would I be in the Ukraine? Would I say, okay, I'd rather be like a satellite country of Germany rather than a satellite country of Russia? I would. I certainly would, but I'm asking, is it worth the sacrifice? It's just a personal feeling that I'm.
Yeah, but you see, this is an impossible question for those who are in Ukraine. I mean, you can ask it from America, but in Ukraine it's just impossible because it's the subjectivity is involved. You are attacked.
Right.
I don't think I hear you, but I don't think it's an option.
Okay.
I planned to enlist in the army in February.
Mm-hmm. No, sure. I seriously, I understand you. Just not being Ukrainian, I also like maybe more like Ari, like not being Ukrainian. I don't see why I would precisely enlist in the Ukrainian army. I don't want to enlist in any army.
Right.
But being a Ukrainian and having to do with the region, I don't see how like people would not have this idea. Of course, you defend like sacrifice pour la patrie and all of this. Anyway, this is just an aside. Sorry, we have to go on. I see, John, yeah, I see your hand, but you will have a chance to ask in the next round. So now let's pass the floor to Arseny.
Yeah, and Artemy, please take a look to the chat, because there is also.
Oh, okay, yeah. Next round, I will look
by
at
the
chat.
way.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's not only a question, but a question about Stasis. So it's really worth taking that. Great. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to this floor. It's really great to share this floor with all of you. And I will talk about more maybe about the distinction between old and new wars following the initial discussion that happened in Facebook, and that actually led us here. So as we all understand, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is striking it in its scale, and I would say in its unexpectedness. Despite all the warnings we had, it was still nice to think that the Russian authorities were using forceful rhetoric as a diplomatic tool, but were not ready for a real invasion. And as we saw, they were not ready properly, and yet they started what turned out to be the largest military conflict in Europe since 1945. And the scale and the nature of this war, its course, its technical features, immediately called into question all the literature on the transformation of war, which began to appear at the end of the Cold War era, and especially in the end of 90s, beginning of the new millennium. And there is a long list of really prominent authors, and of course Michael Hart among them, as well as I would say Martin van Creveld or Mary Calder, and many other of them, and including myself. I apologize for this proud intervention in this list of great minds, but I also published a book with the name War in 21st Century. And all these writings were different, but they shared something similar, saying that how dramatically war and military culture has changed during the last decades, and maybe it's worth taking into account Mary Calder's consideration on that. Contrary to Clausewitz's famous thesis, war now is not a continuation of politics, but a refutation of politics. And new wars for her is a specific social culture, and they are anti-political. They represent an alternative to state governing of social life and of war in particular. And of course, all these theorists agree that war, the good old large-scale war, is no longer appropriate political means. It involves a lot of social, economic, political risks, and the four states in the end of 20th or in the beginning of 21st century, even if they wage war, they are trying not to participate in major conflicts, or do it in some other ways as they did it before. And these may be lengthy campaigns as in Iraq or Afghanistan, but relatively modest in terms of the contingent involved. In other words, the war has changed, and it's different from what the great powers like to practice in the old days. And suddenly we get this Russo-Ukrainian war. And indeed, there may be a desire to interpret it as an old war. And this is, I think, partly correct, or at least understandable. We have, first of all, we have an interstate conflict, not an asymmetric war, as it was usually in the last decade. One of these sides is also waging an imperialist war. It presents itself as a great power, as a regional hegemon, infringement on the zone of interests of which is deadly danger. And unfortunately, this deadly danger is not just a figure of speech. We know that the losses in this war are extremely high, again, comparing to what we saw in the previous conflicts or the previous decades. And usually such a level of losses can be observed in the case of irregular or paramilitary forces participating in the war somewhere in the Middle East or in Africa, for instance. Because, for example, the Iraqi forces that fought on the side of the United States also suffered losses of several tens of thousands of people. But the United States itself lost about 4,500 people for 8 years. And that means they lost much less per month that the Russian army loses per day. And back to Ukrainian war, one of the sides is obsessed with the idea of sovereignty, and in the form in which it would be appropriate to talk about the sovereignty 100 or maybe 200 years ago, not in the 21st century. And the other side uses civic or political nationalism as a means of mobilization that also could be treated as an old tactics or old strategy. So this setting is relevant for the old interstate wars. And we must say that it is also, as our previous speakers said, it is also a very capitalist and neoliberal war. In this sense, there is nothing new about this war. Perhaps I was described as one of who is not a left thinker here in Artemy's Facebook post. As he stated, it is time to seriously discuss what happened, and we organized this online conference with a number of colleagues, mostly but not exclusively from the left. But I also can't help talking about the influence of capitalism on the fact that this war itself became possible. Putin's regime was supported and funded to start the invasion. Even after the annexation of Crimea and proxy war in Donbass, after leaders of Russian opposition and oppositional journalists were killed or imprisoned, it was still appropriate to have business with Putin's Russia. And we cannot ignore the supply of Russian oil and gas to Europe. Yes, there are noticeable sanctions right now, and it is as if a united Europe or united Western world is fighting Russian aggression, and but the trade continues, and especially cynical were the supplies for Russian law enforcement units that were still able during the last year. Against the big background of the inquiry, why are the Russians not protesting and do not stop the war? The European Union has not imposed restrictions on supplies of tear gas, electric discharge weapons, water cannon systems, and many other police munitions till July and even on October of 2022. And it is often said about international companies that left Russia last year, and that's right. But we must also say that many did not leave or trying to go into a shadow. And what is more serious and important, perhaps, that there was no clear policy and culture of interaction with authoritarian states before the invasion. We can also take into account military and security technologies, which were also supplied from the West till the invasion. And so Western companies like Nokia helped to create a video surveillance and face recognition system in Russian cities. And there are many, many others of this sort of the cooperation between the West, first of all, and Russia. It was very convenient to use Russian resources and wealth to ensure the growth of the European economy. And in this sense, Russia was more important rather than Ukraine or any other country facing authoritarian aggression or possible aggression. So in many dimensions, this war is really look like an old war, traditional, conventional war, but still there are a number of factors that indicate that the war in Ukraine is not a bit of the old ultra-violence, as I captured in the title of my talk. So this is not an old war that makes obsolete or senseless the theories of the new wars. First of all, this is evident if we analyze the way Russia is waging this war. In terms of goal setting, this war cannot be compared with the old wars. The Russian political and military command does not seem to seek to start a full-fledged war, and I beg your pardon for this rhetoric. These words can be maybe heard from Russian nationalists and militarists such as Strelkov, but really, if you started a war and realized that it was impossible to lead it as a special operation, as a new war, with rapid regime change and the paralysis of government and the army, and you want to win this war, to gain a military victory, you need to mobilize, and not only to mobilize in terms of recruiting people to the troops, but also to change the economy, to develop a strategy for a long-term war, and deliver large-scale strikes, hit the enemy by combined arts. So the political leadership must specify clear military objectives, what must be captured or destroyed so that you can declare victory. But there is no such thing at all. And I apologize again. First of all, I want the suffering of the Ukrainian people to stop and Ukraine to win. But if you play for the devil, for the Russian side this time, then the order of actions would have to be exactly like this. And this is not happening. So either because the Russian military leadership have ceased to be proper combat officers or strategists and do not understand how to conduct the old conventional war, unlike the Ukrainians who are really waging a normal war, or because the Russian government seeks to end the war by non-military means, to negotiate and to restore business as usual, or maybe to turn this war in something that could be called a forever war, and to have this ongoing conflict on its borders, to use it for some reasons. But all this again testifies that this conflict is a new war when the military means are applied to achieve non-military goals, when they doesn't correspond to the logic of military victory. And what is most noticeable in Russian military policy during this war, I think, this is the demonopolization of the sphere of violence. There are separate power groups operating at the front that are not related to the power structures. The most visible of them is, of course, the Wagner group, or there were also Kadyrov's, how to say, groups in the beginning of war, TikTok warriors, as they were called in Russia and in Ukraine. So, but this is something unimaginable for the old wars. The whole modern project of the state, as we know, was built on creating a rigid hierarchy in the military sphere. The aim was to unify and to control it, and to suppress alternative operational centers, pretending they also have some rights to use military violence. And Russia, a state seemingly obsessed with the idea of sovereignty, splits its military forces right now and allows absolutely extra legal combat units to appear. And this shows that this is, again, a new war, which is often waged by field commanders, and they, whether armies or gangs. But it also shows that the war has little to do with the international politics and is much more Putin's struggle to strengthen the regime. It's also worth paying attention to how this war is publicly presented by the Russian authorities. I would say that contrary to the statements of political realists, Russian authorities do not talk so much about the war as inevitable clash of superpowers and an attempt to find a balance of power or find a safer position. Putin moralized the war in Ukraine, and what's the problem here? There are several of them, actually. Putin, first of all, didn't just use false arguments, but he gave a part of Russian society at least a relatively plausible explanation of what is going on in Ukraine. And he found language to explain the war, to make conformity more acceptable, with such a loophole. And after all, he was not able to say that he attacked Ukraine in order to maximize his own power, of course, and to increase his rating. But this discursive strategy, as I have already said, doesn't allow Putin to describe the war in traditional military and political categories. And in such a big war, that must be done. Otherwise, it will not be possible to mobilize the population politically and militarily, what we actually also see in Russia right now. And that's why it is also not a sort of traditional old wars. And yet, if there is anything historically new in the Russian war in Ukraine, that is, I think, public reaction on it. Yes, there is routinely high public support of war inside Russia, and it's terrible on the one hand, but I would say it's absolutely common, unfortunately, to any unjust wars. So more than 50% supported Vietnam War till Tet Offensive that was in 1968. And so it took 4 years to reassess that war for the American society with all these anti-war movements and in much more socially mobilized society that was the American society in the 60s. Last year, the poll found that more than 80 of respondents believe that Argentina should continue with its claim for the exercise of sovereignty over Malvinas Islands. So again, they still think they should maybe wage another war with Britain for this island. And the war in Iraq was also accepted by more than 70% of Americans and Brits. However, it lost support much faster than the Vietnam War. And already in 2-3 years, the public opinion changed, but still it took really long time for that. And so, well, I would say that there is nothing surprising in such large public support of war in Ukrainian Russian society. But of course, that's a sad fact. People are more likely to support their governments in deciding to start a war. Another question is what this support means, how it is formed, and how states use public opinion as political tool, as well as how long they can fuel militarism due to this image of public support. And I think that is much more important that at the same time we see the reaction of many Russians and many people in Europe, in the North America, and all over the world that not only rallying, as we have just discussed with Michael, but making something. We are seeing a lot of volunteer projects. We have a lot of grassroots projects supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. And I think that this is a dramatic and really powerful moment. Maybe it is, well, I agree with Michael that it's really necessary to realize the nature of the war itself, but at the same time, I think it's still very necessary to act, to react actively to what is happening. And we, I think, should understand that war is not only the movement of troops on the battlefield, and not only the decisions made by respected people sitting in bunkers. War is also how we react to it, how we interpret it. In modern wars, hopefully, as in politics, the role and influence of grassroots initiatives will become higher. Well, I think that the war in Ukraine should be a lesson, including the lesson of supranational consolidation. For me, it was much more important to stay connected to Republic of Letters, to stay connected with my friends in Ukraine or all the world, rather to support Russia at all costs. Will we be able to use this lesson to turn it into something practical? I can only unfortunately support skepticism of Raoul. So I also doubt it would be a rapid change. So there is a force in the broad public reaction to the war and impulse that must be used to prevent the next big or not so big war. But it seems to me that we are now going to really unstable time economically, and people will have to spend more effort to ensure in their lives. So they will be less concerned about the global projects, but at least we should take care to leave the war in Ukraine as a theoretical lesson, as an edification. And still there is something that could be done in practice, I think. This is in new wars. In new war, it is globalized by its nature, and proper cosmopolitan reaction in response to that is support of all forces that oppose the war. To support Ukrainian forces, that is an evident task right now, and that's crucially important. So I think it's even trivial, but also to support all these grassroots initiatives, even to support Russian opposing the war, maybe by guaranteeing asylum to Russian military personnel, by simplifying the ways of leaving Russia for those who doesn't accept and support this war, rather than complicating them to fled Russia. And all this should have been done at the very beginning of the war, maybe even before it. Now it's probably too late, and therefore I think that the war in Ukraine should be viewed as a lesson in order to use this experience in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Arseny. Any questions? Questions to Arseny? We have some questions in the chat. Okay, questions to Michael. In your books, together with Negri, you wrote about the model of understanding war and in the scope of empire as a civil conflict, stasis. Is it possible to understand this war within this model? Well, I kind of started with the same question. If Michael has something to comment.
Well, it's something that I think it's worth definitely reconsidering these questions. But I think both Arseny and Svetlana were questioning the extent to which the conflict between two sovereign nation states is the adequate framework for this. I think. I mean, I don't think one should at all negate the elements of this in this conflict, and the defense of Ukraine certainly fits within that. I guess I remain skeptical that that is a adequate framework, and what Tony and I had meant by this notion about civil war within the global context is just that we need to think of how these conflicts fit within a larger framework, rather than being exterior conflicts, but interior to a larger fact. I mean, but Arseny, you were directly addressing that at the beginning about whether this is in fact an old interstate war and the extent to which it was. I think you are posing the same question that I'm posing, and I guess that the question in the chat was. I guess I don't mean to negate that it's partly true, and I think that's also where you were coming with this, Arseny, but that finally it's not adequate and one has to think in a larger frame. That's a very simple response.
Okay, there are questions in the chat for Arseny. I don't know, people don't want to ask them themselves. I can read.
Well, yeah, if I may, maybe for the first question that was Andrew Denisov, could you please write a little bit more about the hypothesis? Because maybe I just understand you in some wrong way, but well, I'm not sure that there is like a question or opposition to what I have just said, because I was also talking about the capitalism and about this like background that actually made possible for Putin to start this war and to finance it, and just maybe to make a decision that it is possible decision, and that will lead him to some success, that he all know that he will win this war. Would it be a military victory, or maybe what is much more necessary for him, an inside political victory that will allow him to maximize his power and to prolong his regime? So, but if if you're going to stress something contrary to that, maybe you just continue writing in chat. There is another question about the internal support of war in Russia. I will just read it because it wasn't so easy to read the question in chat, so I copied it to Word. The question is, in your estimation, so that the Higher School of Economics supported the war and now is helping Russia to Russify the occupied territories of Ukraine, and what percentage of professors at the Higher School of Economics today supports this war? What percentage of them would agree to work in the occupied territories? Well, I think that there are different Questions. These questions are rather different. First of all, I think that there are not so many professors who loudly opposite this war, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all other people who kept silence are supporting the war, but we can discuss if it's possible to stay in a position to war and not to raise your voice or not. This is another question, but I think it's still possible. The problem is, of course, that there are some groups of professors, or maybe people representing international relations or political studies are more supportive to Russian power, to Russian state, and to war it's waging. But at the same time, I think they will be much more happy to use, well, to stay in Moscow rather than to go to the occupied territories and to Russify them, as you said. So they are very dependent, I think, on their wages, and they realize that it's much more safer to stay in Moscow, not on newly acquired territories.
Okay, John, but keep it short.
Yeah, so briefly, I think the talk about, let's say, peace in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict is, of course, positive, and we need to end this tragedy as fast as possible. But the problem for me that gets raised in this issue is what exactly does peace look like? Is it merely a ceasefire? Because, right, the West seems to associate peace with the defeat of Russian armies and the complete withdrawal from Ukrainian territory. But that's really defeat as opposed to any sort of meaningful peace negotiations or peace settlement. And I think even though we need peace, we need to figure, I guess, if anybody, and this is more of a general question to all of the participants, like what exactly does peace look like? Is it inclusive of Russia? What does it look like for the people who are living in the
I think
Donbass?
that's really important, great question. And of course, there are different perspectives on this problem in short and long distance. And so I think that the Russian vision of peace and like what would be success for Putin's regime is, as I said, prolonged forever war. So not war, not peace. And so for him, it would be better to keep Ukraine in the state of semi-war, semi-peace, as he did in Moldova, for instance, or in Georgia, and raising his power from this instability. And of course, I think that in short terms, peace for Ukraine means that they reoccupy all territories and receive control, establish control on all of them. At the same time, I think that will be really related to their military successes on the battlefield during this year. So I think as for now, there are not so many Ukrainians and Ukrainian politicians who will accept some sort of ceasefire with the current that allows Russia to keep the occupied territories. But who knows if the conflict really take a prolonged character? Will we see a change of minds in Ukraine or not?
Okay, well, I will actually address the same topics in my own talk. So now it's my turn. Could you please interrupt me if I go too long? So I have a presentation actually. Oh, doesn't work. To share your screen? Yeah, I'm trying to share my screen, but it doesn't work for some reason. Why? Because I have too many windows. Just a second. Why doesn't it work? Okay, now. No. For some reason, I have a failure here, and that's um okay, last attempt that I will speak like would anyway. Here, I found it. Here we go. Hopefully you see it now. Yeah. So my talk is entitled, "What is the dominant contradiction?" Sorry. First of all, I want to emphasize the obvious fact that this war was unpredictable precisely in its material realization aspect. Everyone was talking about wars. Countries were waging smaller wars that would only make that would only induce a fear of a larger war like this one. The war between Russia and Ukraine was many times simulated in video games, described in the fiction novels in Russia and Ukraine and across the world. So it's not something totally unheard of. One great novel that really predicted much of what is happening is Pelevin's Snuff, which I recommend to everyone who hasn't read it yet. And the notion of snuff is precisely what we are dealing with. Like suddenly, the events we were kind of accustomed to virtually are happening for real. Why this is what needs explanation. Why has it suddenly realized? Clausewitz at some point says that battles are the cash of the war. Like you had this bank money on your account and then you cash it out, and that's what the battle is. Here, the entire war is like a cashing out of the military imagination and of the existing international conflicts. So there are many ways to explain this, or many approaches to this kind of reality, existential moment. For the purposes of this talk, I draw on Althusser, and he has this great theory of overdetermination, which says that if you have one contradiction, then maybe nothing is happening. But if you have several contradictions in the same spot applied to the same subject, then something may be happening. And I think it is very productive here. Now back to this war. Already there are many confusions, the chaos that was evoked today, and the war poses an intellectual problem, which leads to the absence of the anti-war movement, because the anti-war, the usual suspects of the anti-war movement, they are kind of perplexed, like what's going on. First of all, Russia is kind of a counter-hegemonic force, right? But it is on the right. It is a right-wing force. Then everyone is now talking about decolonialism in the West. That's the latest fashion. But if we apply decolonialism or decolonization theory, here we are perplexed again, because Putin also is in favor of decolonization. He's like moreover like one of its main spokesmen. He wants an anti-American bloc, but at the same time, the relationship Russia-Ukraine are also those of colonization, and there are some post-imperial or imperial problem within Russia itself. So you can basically apply it the way you want. The Cold War heritage that was mentioned too, that some American right like takes it as a continuation of the Cold War. Yeah, of course it does. But at the same time, Russia is now the opposite of communism. It's like the neoliberal, very capitalist society with highly conservative ideology, like not even liberal, but conservative. Russia is in this sense mentally hard to locate, as in Ukraine too. Ukraine is a little easier to locate actually, but also different. So Althusser would say that there is a contradiction, but the poles of these contradictions are like blurred, like maybe they are not that important. What is important is the contradiction itself. Well, here I'm pushing Althusser a little bit. It's like my Althusser. I apologize if I'm not faithful to Althusser. In this sense, there was a precedent already of the same confusion in the Second World War, where Germany and Japan, they exploited part of the same rhetoric as Putin now. And there was a paradox in their stance. Reich famously called fascism a revolutionary emotion in a reactionary form. So they were both. And Hitler and the Japanese government, they evoked this rhetoric of the oppressed, the revolt, the uprising, the proletarian nations were used. The persecution of Jews was in fact kind of a persecution of globalist force that prevents the German nation from flourishing. When Marxists addressed the German situation during the Second World War, of course, they tried to explain it by the domination of the bourgeoisie, but then they were arguing whether it is large bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie. But nevertheless, they couldn't get rid of the paradox. And when they did, they didn't understand the situation. That's hence Stalin's mistakes before the Second World War. Adorno and Horkheimer, of course, they came very close to the understanding of Nazism, speaking of the sadism that is inbuilt into modernity, some kind of enjoyment from violence. But even they univocally thought about it as a imperial right-wing top-down violence, which I'm not sure it was. I mean, not sure it was only that. Reich, in my view, is much better in this sense than Adorno and Horkheimer. So again, back to this war. Most obvious explanations are emotional, subjective. It is clear why Russia became entangled in this mimetic relationship with America. It tries to imitate America. It's a struggle for recognition. So the brilliant book by René Girard, Battling to the End, is maybe one of the best things written about the war in the recent years. But ultimately, it comes to the idea that war is in human nature. People will always fight, and that has to do with this mimetic dueling relationship. Again, it's very applicable to the Russia-America situation and to the Russia-Ukraine relationship too. But it is a psychological explanation. I think it is part of the picture, but it doesn't, again, give a response to the question, what is the contradiction, actually? So actually, there are some substantive contradictions here, not only material, but also ideological. There is a clash that Raul mentioned between liberalism and nationalist authoritarianism. The civilizational tendencies in Europe are obvious. There is a struggle between the revolutionarism, the liberal revolutionarism that United States represents, and of course Maidan in Ukraine was the central event of this entire story. There is a clash with populism. There is a clash between Russian imperialism as opposed to Ukrainian nationalism. So Russia is not nationalist in the narrow sense, right? They are kind of multicultural. We are all one country, and Ukraine is more on the nationalist side. But related to the West, Russia is nationalist. There is a clash of the resource-driven and manufacturing economies. There is a clash of the post-socialist world, the post-Cold War world, as opposed to what was the capitalist world before, and this heritage still plays a role. So all of these accumulate, and all of them together produce this war. So there is an overdetermination in Althusser's sense. There are too many contradictions, and they are all ambiguous. But this is not the end of the story. As clear from my previous account, in all of these contradictions, Russia and Ukraine, but I will focus on Russia now. Russia plays a double role. So again, it's an imperialist country, but it's also kind of an anti-imperialist one. Ukraine, is it part of the empire, or it is a free-loving independent nation? Ambiguous, it's both. Again, Russia's nationalism is ambiguous. Russia is a conservative, old regime style power in its rhetoric, in its policy. At the same time, it exploits the populist language, and truly there is a class component. The Russian army is composed of the distinctly lower class. The brutal behavior of this army is also a protest of like very poor soldiers from the Russian periphery coming to the rich suburbs of Kiev, and these languages exploited in the Russian militarist ideology. So again, the contradictions are there. They overdetermine each other, but it is what is most important is that in all of these contradictions, the contradiction is prior to its elements. To its, like, the relationship is before the relata. So this leads us to understand in the next term that actually we deal with symmetrical complex entities. We have a subaltern empire. It's the concept by Vyacheslav Morozov, which is very applicable, versus a hegemonic colony. We have a capitalist socialism versus a socialist capitalism. And this, I will not linger on this right now, but I've written about this. This is very interesting. Russia is not purely capitalist. It's this kind of socialism becoming capitalism. That's why it's so enthusiastic about capitalism. And in the West, it is the opposite. So then it is clear what the contradiction is, but it is, again, complex. Schelling had the term for this, the relative totalities are opposing here. So we have this fascist anti-fascism in Russia also, because they look like, structurally, typologically, they look like a fascist regime, but at the same time, the rhetoric is anti-fascist, and the historical background is anti-fascist here. And again, the populism that they exploit is very contradictory, because the style of leadership in Russia is very top-down, and bureaucratic elite is very isolated from population. So it's not a populist regime in the literal sense. But the struggle of American Democratic Party against populism is also weird, like symmetrically. The problem is that if we want the multitude revolt against this and build an international anti-war movement, then we have the same problem, because they are also overdetermined. It's not clear if the multitude is bourgeoisie or the proletariat. It's kind of both. I'm speaking of Michael's and Tony's multitude here. The exploitation, the troubles, do they have a national and therefore class nature, or do they have an international nature? Like if you are poor in India, whose fault is this? Bourgeois class or the American imperialism? Or maybe like American imperialism is even like trying to help you against your dominant bourgeois class. This is also a possible perspective. So this, for me, explains that the anti-war movement is hard to build. That's why, I promised to amend Althusser a little bit. So it's not only that the oppositions are accumulating, but that you as a subject are determined in a contradictory way. One contradiction contradicts another contradiction. For you. So the factors that accumulate that point to the conflict, like, okay, we have a conflict with Ukraine there, but then each new factor of this conflict contradicts the previous factor, but it's still like contradicts in terms of substance, in terms of your self-identity, determination, but at the same time it does point at the contradiction. The contradiction is there, and this accumulation of contradictory factors is ultimately going to produce a real event, this snuff moment, I would call it. So in a sense we can like draw parallel to Lacan and Zizek here. It's, when you don't understand, then you act. So it's not like action is prior, activity is prior to thinking, but the opposite. That's the logic of Lacanian passage à l'acte. So again, then the next question, what is to be done in this state of confusion and in the highly dialecticized international situation? Now, I also think that we are potentially at a constituent moment, that there needs to be an anti-war movement. What do I mean by the anti-war movement? It's not like an ad hoc movement, okay, to cease the hostilities, because it's difficult. We are not sure at which moment they have to be seized, but we need a project. There is no peace, and there will be no peace until there is a global project of how the world should actually operate. the only project is the hegemonic project that was just described by Raul. Okay, we build socialism, we build capitalism at the same time. Again, not a very consistent project. And also we build the green energy. Okay, but this is not really a project for political arrangement in the world. It is obvious that it cannot work, and that like 2/3 of the world are not involved. There is no project, and that's why I'm a proponent of the world polity as an ideal. And the world polity, which would be obviously a federal one, would precisely aim to accommodate the contradictions I mentioned, because at each level there would be a power and authority, but it would also be subordinate to the world authority, to the world organization, with a lot of independence. So this duality, colony, empire, complex governance of multicultural polity, and at the same time a certain opposition with the global forces, all of these would be thought through, negotiated, and put into paper as a kind of world constitution. Lacking this, again, this horror will continue, because again, for me, the problem is that simply like no one thinks. The failure is intellectual. I hate saying it. Ultimately, no. Then it is moral, of course, a moral failure, and also a failure of military intelligence, I guess, on the Russian side. But ultimately, it comes up to the incapacity to think in Russia, but also in the West. Okay, thank you. I need to stop this. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, I think Georgi has a question. Can we?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you very much to you and all the other presenters. I wanted to ask a question that speaks to what you said in the beginning. I very recently came across this debate between Dugin and Yuk Hui, the theoretician of technology. And I saw something that was quite frankly pretty infuriating. Dugin was trying to use Brazilian counter-anthropology, the ideas of multinaturalism, Eduardo Vieira Castro, and all that, where you have this, just to be said, where you have this moment of there are ontological differences that cannot be explained by the other's epistemology, just ideas so that we can give the other sort of the right of and the space of self-determination. Dugin was kind of using it to say Russia is actually ontologically distinct, so let us do what we do, the West shouldn't. So on and so
Exactly.
forth.
Yeah, that's what many of them say. Yeah.
And this, yeah, exactly. And but this sort of imperial appropriation of a decolonial framework is for me pretty interesting. And I thought one of the conditions of possibility of such a imperial appropriation would be precisely what Michael Hart said in the beginning, this transfer of the Soviet project into a Great Russia project by canceling out the socialist aspect. So then I thought maybe it would be useful to look at the Soviet 60s humanist Marxism, because that was the sort of an alternative project to what was going on at that time. I wouldn't really look at the dissidents because it's pretty clear what they would say today, but maybe like those people like Ilyenkov and others had some sort of maybe have something to teach us today, or that experiences in general could be something that helps us today. I don't really have an answer to this, but I would really like to know any yours, but also anybody else's opinion on this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. No, of course I do have an opinion, and this is a very good question. We've been doing some work in the Stasis Center in the European University, like before the war. Now we probably will continue this in some other arrangements, but Stasis Center also continues to function. Yeah, I mean, exactly. The Western Marxism was overly negativistic. The Soviet Marxism was overly positive, overly optimistic. But these were two symmetrical biases. Both were problematic. Part of the problem that the transition from socialism to capitalism brought to Russia was this kind of negativistic outlook that is not only characteristic of the left, but also of the mass culture. And Russia does have a, I'm not sure how exactly it is linked to orthodoxy, but it's certainly something special to Russian culture, that it did have this kind of, yeah, more substance looking, I would say, well, left conservative out. That's why part of the tension, the ideological tension with the West culturally, is that the West right now, it doesn't tolerate any conservatism, like real conservative, not the Trump, but the true conservative. It doesn't tolerate it, and there was a very hard clash. I mean, originally, now, right now it's too late. I mean, this tension between Putin and the West is not only ideological. It is also like, you know, basically people became mad. But like if you go 15 years ago, I think there was something to discuss there in terms of like culture and ideological fit. But that's what I'm saying. We should try to build some kind of synthesis. We should know what the positions are, not to demonize them, accommodate them. Of course, the other, the Middle East, the Far East, the Latin America cultures, and we should build a synthesis. Here, I mean, I hate saying that, but there is a grain of truth to Dugin. It's just that you know, the solution should be universalist. It cannot be unilaterally organized by Russia just based on these, on its some kind of very subtle differences. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other? Oh, there in the chat, and Anton says that flat ontology is kind of ontological justification of Dugin's multipolar world geopolitics.
I mean, there is also a question above that statement.
Yeah. What outcome of the war would satisfy the Russian leadership and Russian population and accommodate the contradiction? Well, to accommodate the contradictions, we should rebuild the United Nations and build a federal world state. So a peace agreement with Russia would not accommodate all the contradictions. But yeah, I mean, Russia seeks recognition. I mean, that's like the classical thing, Kozevian purposes. But right now it is too late to satisfy it only on this ground. Obviously, there will be some peace arrangement sooner or later. Either we will all die in a nuclear war, or there will be some arrangement. And through this arrangement, Russia will be recognized. But it's not, you know, one thing for Russia to be recognized, but another thing is for Putin to be recognized. It's much more tricky. What is his future? Yeah. So, but it's about recognition. My talk was about saying like what is there beyond the recognition. The recognition is there. It's obvious. I wrote an article about in 2015, and kind of like the intellectual landscape was absolutely clear already then. But again, that paper of mine is psychological. Now I'm thinking of more objective things. And yeah, and Anton about flat ontology. Yeah, sure. I mean, these people want kind of a world democracy for nations and empire. But the problem is that it doesn't work intellectually, because democracies should then be democratic inside. So this world outlook is not consistent, not rational, not logical. But neither is the American idea, where democracy is only inside the country, and among the countries there is no democracy. It's another extreme. This also doesn't work. So nothing works, basically. If there are no other immediate or mediate reactions, let's move on to our other speaker, who is Svetlana Matviyenko, who is from Ukraine. I understand that just very recently from Ukraine physically, but she also works at Simon Fraser University in Canada.
Hi, everyone, and I'm going to share my screen with you, my PowerPoint. Okay, at this moment, you should be seeing it. Do you?
Yes, we do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I spent 2 last years in Ukraine because of family reasons. And then because of the war reasons, because I couldn't get out. And I live in Canada and work there. And now I'm currently in Germany, which is going to be my new home for the next year, probably, or something. Okay, and thanks for the invitation to this discussion. And I'm quite, you will see that indeed there is so much of reciprocity between how we see this war, and I will speak about it in very similar terms, but probably also developing some other my theoretizations about the models that many of the speakers already outlined. So I'll begin. And I have a paper, I'm reading it. It will take 15 minutes, and I have the slides that will go along. So it's been, and one more final note is that in my look at this war, in this presentation, I'm also considering some technical moment here, so which was not really addressed in the conversation before. So I hope this will be, again, my contribution. All right. So it's been acknowledged by war analysts that technologically speaking, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war has accumulated tactics and strategies from both World War I and World War II. It is at the same time a trench and artillery war and an aircraft war where computation is merged with anti-aircraft fire, when battlefield strategies are assisted by probabilistic calculation. This war is also a cyber war, where with that kinetic use of jet bombers, helicopter gunships, artillery, rocket batteries, tanks, small arms, and other conventional weapons, it involves electronic command control and communication and weapons targeting system now amplified by signal and open source intelligence, PsyOps, AI, Starlink, and Maxar. Any weapon produced now, we hear, is required to be tested in Ukraine. Every non-weapon technology entertains checking its military capability. And so here again, we have what was already mentioned by a number of speakers, certain merge of peaceful and military, which is, of course, very typical for modernity, 20th century, and a kind of very symptomatic of what is happening. In preparation for missile attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, Russian forces use aerial ground-based intelligence, and they monitor and analyze social networks with or without special software. So do Ukrainian forces to strike on the enemy's positions in the Ukrainian east and south. This is where the cyber and kinetic means crossover and complement each other, until it is difficult, if at all possible, to distinguish between them to compose a hybrid cyber conventional war in which the two elements either fully coincide or phase in and out during complex asymmetrical military confrontations. In other words, cyber war of the 21st century is not about lower intensity, nor it is less kinetic, even when it involves high precision weapons and AI. Instead, it demonstrates how most recent technologies combine with the regimes of techniques and munitions from World War I and World War II, including rifles and rockets, trenches and dirt, and what we know from the Russian and Soviet history of warfighting, the reliance on unrestricted supply of cheap disposable human resources drawn from the colonized First Nation communities and many strategically underdeveloped ethnic and social groups. But there is another continuity between the wars of the 20th century that the wars of the 21st century clearly seen in the current war. As Peter Sloterdijk brought out to our attention 2 decades ago, the discovery of the environment took place in the trenches of World War I. It was since the first use of gas warfare that the atmo-terrorist model was set to become prominent in war fighting for the next 109 years. The 20th century, he projects, will be remembered as the age whose essential thought consisted in targeting no longer the body, but the enemy's environment, the immediate atmospheric envelope. Since air and atmosphere are in the primary media for life, what is targeted is the air milieu in which enemy bodies move, subject to their own breathing reflex, end quote. Such atmo-terrorist model that uses war pollution as a weapon is topological in how it targets the subject's homeostatic body, or the body that is in constant communication with the environment from the inside, as the body has no other choice but breathing the deadly air in. The subject of the war is the subject of terror environments. By terror environments, I understand the realms of double targeting of Ukraine's population by weapons and by information simultaneously. Disinformation propaganda generated by the Russian state-controlled media has gotten a lot of attention. The interest, however, was mostly towards the internal vector of the Russian disinformation and its impact on the citizens of the Russian Federation. The external vector of the Russian disinformation that reaches into the Ukrainian media sphere has not been given enough attention, but it is significant for the formation of terror environments. Every rocket attack, every reported case of extreme torture, every documented case of genocide is followed not only by denial, but also by mockery on the Russian state TV and associated social media channels. This content is disseminated broadly. And the double-targeted Ukrainian subject of the war has almost no choice to avoid such harmful and traumatic encounter. There is no way to sign off. And I can tell you from my own experience of viewing thousands, like hundreds, not probably thousands, but hundreds of videos. And because in its majority, and that's another very interesting phenomenon that I'm trying to theorize and write about recently, is that this whole kind of turn of Ukrainian population into activists who collect witnesses, who create records of war crimes. And this is amazing. Like the scope of this event is really amazing because no matter who you were, like even some, let's say, fashion bloggers before the invasion obsessed only about the stars of Russian pop scene now go to Bakhmut, right? And this is happening on the scale unbelievable. So in a certain way, I even wonder how after this war is over and when certain reparation and of course will start happening, how we even would deal with the amount of let's say data and records and witnessing, etc., etc. So that's another very interesting thing, because I think the scope of these records collected like through the grassroots initiative, and again, what technologies allowed from the outside, right? There's a Maxar and whatnot and Google. So it's quite unprecedented. But to bring myself back into what I'm saying, I just want to remind that this whole initiative and this whole obligation, really obligation today that many, like most of whom I know in Ukraine, kind of feel responsible, is to collect, to record, to do something in this way. Even if they do not it for YouTube channel, they do it for themselves. But there is a kind of the drive to witness that implies that you watch it. So every butcher happens, you just watch every fucking video online to know what happened there. And you feel a kind of, if you sign off, you almost betray something. And with this involvement, with this viscerality, and this particular new kind of type of witnessing that is happening, this is something very interesting to think about. But again, makes everyone extremely vulnerable. It's a kind of a new vulnerability, new sensitivity when you are actually on the rocket attacks, like constantly all the time, right? So as you know, yesterday it was from the morning till night, my siren on my phone still here in Germany was on and on and on and on. So anyway, so there is no way to sign off, just like you cannot stop breathing. When genocidal jokes have become mundane, this is not information war as we knew it. What we need to recognize here is a qualitative shift indicating the transition from the disinformation practices of deception as part of information and cyber warfare to the strategic production of terror. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when the imperial state exercised its right to kill on the territory of another sovereign state, was justified by the Russian government as a necessary state of exception, a special operation, not war and not even blitzkrieg, as it was often kind of discussed or from the outside. Because even blitzkrieg still implies a conduct in accordance with these laws of war, but warfare without clear definitions that uses unconventional techniques and models of employment, including terror. The ethno-terrorist model at work during the Russia-Ukraine war has a nuclear dimension. In the first weeks of the full-scale invasion, we witnessed an unprecedented military occupation of the nuclear power plants. First, within first hours of invasion, when the Russian forces entered the territory of the Chernobyl nuclear power station, and here, of course, I need to make this note that, of course, Chernobyl is not a proper nuclear power station, right? So it's a state enterprise for decommissioning of nuclear, but it has kind of a huge deposit of worked fuel, which poses a huge threat anyway, if it would have been destroyed. And of course, later the occupation of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, that becomes the center of an ongoing international nuclear safety crisis, more accurately described as an act of nuclear terrorism. So this is, of course, a still from infamous video of burning Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, which, of course, nobody probably could sign off watching. But I'll give you a common picture by Maxar. Although two of its units 5 and 6, were shut down immediately after the invasion to reduce risk, units 1 and 4 appeared in the center of a 2-hour heavy combat, after which a fire broke out in a training facility outside the main complex. It was later reported that a large caliber bullet pierced an outer wall of Unit 4, and an artillery shell hit the transformer at Unit 6. It was already clear back then that these instances of nuclear terrorism and threatening with a full realization of the grimest scenario, turning the nuclear power infrastructure into a nuclear bomb. Soon after the Russian forces got control over the premises of the nuclear plant, they disconnected cable internet and some mobile services around the site, which is a Chernobyl scenario, if you know the technicity of that event, making monitoring impossible in the state of information blackout. So there is also a particular type of information blackout that can also apply to the way how they manage the information infrastructure around Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station specifically. As a result, the International Atomic Energy Agency lost access to the real-time monitoring of radiation levels. Such information blackout, while the shelling of the nuclear plant's premises continues, creates a terror environment of that atmo-terrorist model, where the realms of cyber and nuclear intersect and the boundaries of such terror environment expand far beyond the Ukrainian territory, speaking of topology, opening the realm for the international nuclear blackmail. The action of the Russian forces disregarded all points of Budapest Memorandum, of course, of 1994, that prohibited the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States, the countries that possess nuclear weapons, from threatening or using military force or economic coercion against Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, as a result of which these countries gave up their nuclear weapons. We had never been so close to a nuclear catastrophe as we were in mid-August 2022, people whom I interviewed from the station telling me. Due to the multiple attempts of disconnecting the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant from the Ukrainian power grid, until after a visit from International Atomic Agency delegation in early September, the last working reactor was put in a cold shutdown on September 11, which requires less power for cooling the system that could now tolerate brief and very much longer electricity outages. And back to the discussion of everyone and many contributions today. So the case of nuclear terrorism during the Russia-Ukraine war is part of a complex asymmetric warfare. And even though I outlined these two vectors here, they, of course, are not symmetrical. I propose to distinguish at least two vectors, but now I see more, but I'm not ready to speak of them yet. But I think we have to kind of move towards this multidimensionality so far. And in this conversation, at least two of them were outlined. So these two vectors of aggressive blackmail, as that also reveals the overdetermined nature of the ongoing war. One vector is inter-imperial, and it concerns the aggressive processes of redistribution of power between several major players of international politics and economy. Another vector is colonial imperial, and it concerns the imperial relation of the Russian Federation towards Ukraine. Here, the inter-imperial communication unfolds according to the logic of deterrence, understood as a threat or force applied by one party to convince another party to refrain from initiating a particular course of action. While it is extremely aggressive, it is still a communicative exchange. Only the part that nuclear weapons play in such exchange is nothing to do with restraint, as we knew from previous scenarios, but with acceleration. The circles of such communication, understood broadly to include various political economic transactions, should not break. The system will and have to go on. The system strives for rebooting itself, even if it significantly transforms in the process. The colonial imperial vector in this trajectory unfolds according to non-communication. It sets the direction for the relation of suppression, subsumption, annihilation, and erasure. All negotiations are suspended indefinitely. Ukraine does not exist, we are told. The colonial imperial vector sets the process to make this claim a reality, even if after the fact of enunciation. And here it also links nicely to what Artemi was speaking about, referring to psychoanalytic writers, right? A kind of a strange temporality, convoluted temporality that it also is in play in this war, which is important to investigate, I think, to understand certain moves and hopefully speak about the futures which I am so terrified of and pessimistic about. And that's where I will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. All right. Are there any questions or reactions? So how do you evaluate this relationship between, on the one hand, there is a flurry of information, media, pictures, etc., the so-called information war, as they call it in Russia. On the other hand, as you said, there is a blockage of communication, and even surprisingly, the success of both sides in filtering certain information. So again, it's not surprising that this war is so highly mediatized. What is surprising is that the channels are narrowed down in a way. And what do you think? How is this possible?
Well, it is possible because I guess technological capabilities today allow that, right? So there is no way for fully filter everything, right? And there are ways of slowing down even the most intense information flows. What's interesting, but probably at this moment it's too early and too hard to talk about this, is what the dynamic of all those things. What I've been doing in Ukraine like this year was one of the major, my kind of interest was precisely that. So at this moment, I'm not ready to talk about this, only apart from indicating the complexity of all these initiatives, failures of certain initiatives, and the kind of like overlapping of these initiatives of either acceleration or restraint, right? So in terms of actually the kinetic action and the relation between those, but that's definitely is happening, and this is one thing I will note. But even despite all these initiatives, another thing that really looked quite interesting to me is, which I already mentioned in terms of recording the accounts, the witnessing accounts, and etc., is what this complete sense of overwhelming. And I've been, as a media scholar, I'm talking about overwhelming for 15 years, right? And yet this is overwhelming we've never seen in terms of at least kind of information that was presented as important or necessary for understanding the events. The amount of experts, you can imagine, right? So there are immediately all people who know. This is a very interesting, like entire kind of, paranoid, basically, sphere that has shaped itself, right? When it is so easy and the most desirable to connect all dots. So everyone who is engaged there, like the immediate effect is that how the subject of the terror environments as I designed them, but probably also outside because these environments extend, is how we all want to make sense of things, connecting those dots, right? So it's almost like a kind of cancerous sense making, right? So unnecessary, expensive, unlimitless, where suddenly dots do connect. And that's one of these kind of effects of what media sphere allows today. And so many deposits right? So I think we are so much beyond of calling them, in fact, disinformation war, right? Because not only for the reasons that I mentioned here, for the sake of kind of making an argument and creating this notion of terror, or like arguing for terror, but also because there are so many intentions not to disinform, but inform, right? So we can maybe speak about misinformation or just information, dropping all those things and looking for other qualifications for certain informational inputs in this entire, literally paranoid media environment. Too many people who know.
Do you have ideas of what could be the correct model of media? First of all, to try to break through the wall of misinformation in Russia, because that's what everyone is like searching for. Unfortunately, Telegram and other social networks, they don't serve the service of objective and independent informing, because people immediately side with their own Telegram channels, and these Telegram channels are usually more extremist than even the state TV.
Well, here I'm also
what is to be done? You know, during the Cold War, of course, the Voice of America and BBC were very efficient. You know, when I was a child, I was sitting at my country house, and every evening I was listening to BBC, while it was, of course, blocked by the, you know, by the noise from the Russian transmitters. But now there is no obvious strategy.
There is no obvious strategy. And this is a kind of a sad conclusion, but maybe the only way of slowing down is a certain awareness, or awareness people who understand it better should be kind of informing others. Awareness, of course, has to do with, quite familiar to all of you, things as a subject who, the subject consuming information was created quite a while ago, right? So, and being that consumer is being this passionate consumer, right? So really consuming what you like, looking less to kind of some other sides and etc. So certain consumption of information that is guided by passions and attachments, right? So all those things, how we are taught, how the subject of consumption is taught to mobilize for other life choices, right? So, and the information consumption is very much like this, but I think it's even more intensified in terms of, you know, like search for the answers. And so this is definitely not a good strategy, but because that's precisely embedded so deeply in the model, how all the platforms build the relationship with us, or how we build as users, so not to redirect the responsibility, right? So how we build and how we consent to a certain relation with this platform, right? So we consume as they taught us, and that's how we do it. So, and that's probably something to be more aware of. And I guess what is in the perspective here is a certain rethinking of the notion of truth, even if we speak about any sort of post-truth era as a place. We are speaking Lacanian.
Michael?
I just had a very small question. The descriptions of nuclear power plant attacks, of course, are terrifying. What I was wondering is if you think that the blackmail of nuclear destruction is really the same as it has been in the past, the way it's being used in this war, or whether there's something qualitatively different. I mean, I realize that here it's more about the threat of creating disasters at nuclear power plants rather than the explosion of nuclear weapons, but maybe it's the same logic of blackmail that we've lived in for a long time about this. That's what I was just questioning. I was trying to think And how do you see the role here of this
Yeah, I
nuclear
think-
blackmail or threat of nuclear destruction?
Yeah, of course, again, from what can be said at this moment, it's at the same time similar and different, right? So we do recognize similar strategies and they mobilize similar fears, anxieties, and imaginaries, right? So it's all there. And that's where I think with this communication with the world is happening, right, by kind of very much mobilizing that logic. But then there are some quite interesting things that I've discovered through my ethnography and communication with people who either worked or work now at in those places. And they have to do, again, with something, again, beyond state. And that's where someone told me, like literally like in December, that, first of all, we of course speak about occupation moving along infrastructural lines. And these are energy infrastructure, right? So there is a particular development of the kinetic action that, or even let's say rocket strike, right? So the energy infrastructure is targeted. So in a certain way, the energy infrastructure is a kind of like a strike map of the war, but also, the occupation kind of map. So in a certain way, when this occupation is happening, I heard from the director of Energoatom, Kotin, who often talks about the theory that he himself and some part of the delegations heard from Putin, which is kind of certain knowledge, again, this imperial knowledge that the entire atomic energy kind of like infrastructure belongs to Russia, right? So even if Soviet Union dissolves, and people in his circle also kind of thought that even if Soviet Union dissolves, the atomic energy has to be maintained through Russia.
Very interesting. I didn't know that. That explains a little bit this story with the
again,
power station.
Still to be confirmed and researched, but there is this very interesting interview. That interview was given by Kotin to Yulia Latynina back then, I think somewhere in during the time of initial occupation of Zaporizhia, so worth rewatching and researching more on that. So that's one of the things, right? So it's a kind of something that is already embedded in certain moves. But then there is this very interesting human factor, which someone told me in December. That's what I started talking about. When the occupation of those stations was easy, not only because people, so for one reason, of course, because the workers of the station couldn't resist being aware of the danger and would rather let the occupier in and somehow negotiate inside. So that was one reason why it was so easy. It's a kind of like, speaking this technological language, it was backdoor immediately in the energy infrastructure, right? So easy to enter, and they went precisely this way. They went where those black doors were installed. And then there is another thing, but this particular allegiance of the workers of such industries, specifically atomic industry, the allegiance to the industry comes first, and then comes the allegiance to the state, because of this specific, right, kind of way. And again, speaking about non-state actors, right? So certain allegiance to the industry itself for the reasons why they didn't resist, because they know that they had to be there and maintain the infrastructure, etc. Right? So you probably heard about workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant doing 600-hour shift, right? And we know less about what is happening on Zaporizhia now, nuclear power station. Probably not that long, because they actually found many ways to rotate people, but also long hours, torture. People go literally through torture room, electrocution, beating, and returning to the station. So the level of kind of terror and, kind of squeezing some knowledge from them as they think, as the occupiers think, is quite unprecedented. But at the same time, as people also explained to me, as the workers explained to me, that this particular knowledge that the Russian forces think they can sort of extract is not extractable because it's a so tacit knowledge, and even your kind of long education in the industry sometimes is not enough. It takes over 10 years maybe to acquire such half, scientific, half intuitive way of, relation with that technology. And at the same time, without understanding this, people are being constantly tortured and, required to teach others very fast from Rosatom to kind of, maintain the status. So this is definitely new, right? So all these events are happening not only in that realm of deterrence, where inter-imperial realm of deterrence, where it's literally communicative, but here we deal with a new physicality and terror of a non-communicative reason, where again, we came into some medieval times, but with the knowledge of electric current, I guess, and the function of the body.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. No, this is very medieval in a way, modern medieval. All right. So thanks so much, Svetlana. And then we have our last speaker, who is last but not the least, who is Sandra Mezzadra from the University of Bologna, of course, very well-known and influential political theorist. We will go over our time, as I alerted you long in advance. So you have your proper 20 minutes to speak and then 10 minutes for questions. Thank you, Sandro.
Thank you so much, Artemi, and thank you for organizing this timely and challenging conversation. Both Svetlana and Raul have stressed the multidimensional nature of the war, and I will take kind of global angle on the war, on its implications. Although I want to say that I remain acutely aware of the huge amount of pain, death, devastation that this war, as any war, generates on the ground, which means in Ukraine. But I think a global angle is needed, and this is particularly because we are surrounded by people who claim that globalization is over. Already during the pandemic, we started to hear such words as decoupling, reshoring, near-shoring, friend-shoring, and this kind of rhetoric has intensified during last year. My point, to put it very quickly, is that we are not facing the end of globalization, but rather a violent scramble to control spaces of globalization, to control global spaces that are far from being smooth, contrary to the ways in which they were imagined and rhetorically celebrated in the 1990s. I think to understand the global stakes of the Ukraine war, we must take a radical distance from the rhetoric of globalization that was, in a way, forged in the 1990s. We need to make a distinction between that rhetoric and what I call with Brett Nielsen, actually existing global processes, which are not necessarily easy to combine, and among which frictions, tensions, and even conflicts are the rule rather than the exception. What I have in mind are global processes like, for instance, migration or digitalization, finance, logistics, platformization, patterns of mixed governance. To look at the way in which these global processes produce spaces beyond the nation, to look at the ways in which these spaces generate frictions with the existing organization of the international world is particularly important to me. Moreover, it is important to remind that the end of globalization was celebrated or lamented many times after the beginning of the new century. 9/11, the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 that seemed to pursue a project of unilateralism in contrast with the multilateralism that was associated to globalization in the 1990s. But there was maybe a moment that was more important for our discussion today. And this moment is, of course, the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. The financial crisis was accompanied by a rise of China that seemed to challenge the existing hegemonic organization of the world system. The way in which China reacted to and proved particularly effective in managing the shock of the financial crisis is a salient feature of most histories of this period. In response to the outside shock posed by the market force in the West, China was able to muster great resources and energies, which allowed it not only to overcome the impact of the collapse of global trade in 2008, but also to start a process of economic reorganization beyond the world factory, the factory of the world, and to renegotiate its interdependence with the United States. And to make a long history short, in the wake of the crisis of 2007 and 2008, whose effects circulated for many years in the conduits of global capitalism, it was clear that we confronted a situation marked by what Adam Tooze calls centrifugal multipolarity. I think this notion of centrifugal multipolarity is important for our discussion, is important to grasp the stakes of the Ukraine war. and needless to say, I use multipolarity in a sense that is completely different from the one in which, for instance, Dugin uses it. Anyway, after the 2007 and 2008 crisis, the world system had been disrupted and in a way shattered to the point that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has radically challenged its stability and structure. So a first point I want to propose to our discussion today has to do with what thinkers like Giovanni Arrighi and other scholars of the world system theory have described since the early 1990s, indeed, as a crisis of US global hegemony. I think we must take in a strong way this crisis as a background for our analysis of the Ukraine war and of its global implications. Needless to say, speaking of a relative decline of the US global hegemony does not imply a civilizational rhetoric of decline. It simply points to the fact that the US has increasingly lost its capacity to lead the war, which is the original meaning of hegemony. It simply points to the fact that no Washington consensus is in sight. So what kind of world order and disorder will emerge in the next years and decades is a very general, of course, but also urgent question that we have to ask against the background of the Ukraine war. The relative crisis of US global hegemony. What about the West? This is another important issue, I think. I must say that over the last years, I have been often reminded of what Stuart Hall wrote in the early 1990s in brilliant essays on globalization. You will remember that his point was, I repeat, in the early 1990s, that globalization had a kind of hidden side. It was not only the triumph of the US, of the West, and this hidden side was what Hall called the moment of the slow, uncertain, protracted decentering of the West. Well, I think this slow decentering of the West has accelerated in the last 2 decades. And today's attempt to rebuild the unity of the West under the military aegis of the US and NATO is characterized by the awareness that the West is only a part of the world. It means that the West has eventually shed its universalist language and ambitions. I think that stressing the notion of multipolarity to analyze the world system in the wake of the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 opens an interesting angle also on Putin's rhetoric and on his miserable anti-colonial tones that were mentioned by Artemi before. The point is that the world was already multipolar long before Putin's wicked decision to invade Ukraine. How can we make sense of this decision? I must say that for me, the invasion of Ukraine was totally unexpected. And in recent years, in my attempt to come to grips with the mutations of the world system, I never took Russia seriously. And maybe this has to do with a kind of Marxist bias, you know. From an economic point of view, the real emerging power is China, is not Russia. But so I think that what we can say is that behind the decision to invade Ukraine, there was the project of an empire of the periphery or of a subaltern empire to carve out a territorial gross realm for its economy. Russia is an actor whose current economic power rests not on size, but rather on the control of strategic resources and assets. So the way in which this project was justified and supported by civilizational tones make it particularly unbearable from my point of view. Let me conclude by harking back to China, that was not really at the center of our conversation today, but is definitely an important actor in the global scenario surrounding the Ukraine war. If you read such official papers like the new NATO security concept or the new US national security strategy that were released in the past months, it is clear that behind Russia, the real competitor is the Popular Republic of China. The Popular Republic of China, I quote from the national security strategy of the Biden administration, is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. So are we really facing the prospect of a new Cold War that was critically discussed by Michael and others today? Or are we living through a hegemonic transition, to speak the language of world system theory? We have to remind that in the past, hegemonic transitions have always been shaped by a concatenation of wars, which gives us the idea of the dangers of the current conjuncture. Nonetheless, I don't think we are living a kind of straightforward hegemonic transition as the one from the UK to the US. And this is because what is really new today is the intensity of the disconnection between territorialism and capitalism, to continue to use concepts from world system theory. To put it very shortly, for want of time, I am convinced that contemporary leading processes of valorization and accumulation of capital resist the logic of territorialization, which does not mean that such logic cannot count on powerful fractions of capital to support it. And the war in Ukraine is creating the conditions for such alliances, which also means for old and new configurations of imperialism. The current proliferation of regimes of war well beyond Ukraine and Russia, Raoul talked about that, is part and parcel of this scenario. And even the rhetoric of a new Cold War, I mean, it's clear that the differences between the current situation and the bipolar confrontation of the Cold War are very huge. I'd like to expand on that, but anyway, if the rhetoric of a new Cold War continues to be used by specific actors of international politics and not merely within the West, to be sure, it's clear that this can lead to an intensification and crystallization of the competition between China and the US with catastrophic implications, I think. I conclude with very simple words by saying that everybody interested in emancipative politics, in nurturing and fostering emancipative politics has to take as a strategic priority the effort to stop these trends. And to stop these trends, we have first of all to struggle with any means necessary to stop the war in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandro. Any reactions to what Sandro said? Questions? Michael?
Yeah, I had one thing. I mean, that was a lot of those things were very interesting, Sandro, and the way you redeploy the notion of centrifugal multipolarity seems really great to me. I just wanted to ask a small thing that struck me when you say that before the war, before the invasion, you weren't taking Russia seriously at the upper echelons of the global hierarchies, let's say. And I agree. I certainly wasn't either. And I guess my question is, to what extent this is this operation on the part of the current Russian government, like, what are its prospects for success of launching Russia to that role by emphasizing its nuclear capabilities, by its military might, etc. And what are the chances that this is really just a a last gasp of a certain kind of outdated power. I guess I'm wondering, I mean, of course, one has to take the, as you said, take Russia seriously after the invasion. We have to now in this current moment, but that doesn't mean that it will be a successful, I mean, my inclination, but this is an unreflected one. My inclination is to think that, well, this is a futile attempt at creating the relevance on the like I say, on the upper echelons of the global stage. But I'm very curious both what you, Sandro, and what others think about whether, you know, another way of reacting to it, of what Sandro said was, well, we were wrong not to take, to include Russia in the same way we were thinking about China in the development of new global power centers, and that this is forcing us to recognize the reality of it. Okay, I don't know.
Yes, I like the term outdated that you used, because in a way it grasps an important aspect of the current predicament, which is, to put it quickly, the kind of emphasis on territorial expansion and conquest that characterizes Russia, while such an emphasis does not characterize neither the US nor China. If you look at the way in which both the US and China are building their, let's say, poles from the angle of multipolarity, I mean, you are immediately confronted with a very sophisticated mix of territorial logic and non-territorial expansion. In the case of Russia, the territorial logics seems to prevail in a very unilateral way, but nevertheless it is working on the ground, and it is creating many problems from the point of view, let's say, of the international world. Let me add something for clarification. When I talk about the territorialism, I take the notion from Giovanni Arrighi, basically, and I stress the relevance of the legal political principle of territoriality in the definition of territorialism. I say this because I don't want to give the impression that for me the most relevant current trends in capitalist development are fully deterritorialized. They are not fully territorialized. Even the most ethereal, you know, digitalization is a territorialized process, but its territorialization works according to logic that are different from the traditional legal and political principle of territoriality that characterizes the political spaces of states. To conclude about Russia, what I have in mind when I talk about a gross realm is a kind of a concentrated and integrated system of management of the global resources and assets that China has, that Russia has at its disposal. But I need to add that precisely talking about such resources and the infrastructures that are needed for the circulation of those resources makes clear that this growth round, even if Russia succeeds in building it, will be dependent on other spaces, and in particular on China. So what I see looming at the end of the war, and even independently of the way in which the war will end, is an increased dependence of Russia from China.
Raul.
Yeah, thank you. Just a comment on the last interventions. On the basis of Svetlana's developments and Sandro's considerations about territoriality and peace, I think that there is something that we haven't addressed directly, but is absolutely key here. We're speaking on the basis of a certain, we've been speaking on the basis of a certain distinction between so-called objective processes and ideological processes, narratives, and so on. And I think that doesn't work like that anymore. I think that the key issue here, and it has to do with my ideas about the war regime as an ordering procedure on society and population, is that the key issue here is, of course, energy and resources, but also production of subjectivity. Production of subjectivity is also a valorizational, a value-producing industry, and is key in order to adequate each actor's objectives. But at the same time, there is no any kind of production subjectivity here. And I think that the trend that comes from First World War, and something I address in my book, is that war regimes and, of course, war machines, and this is something that Svetlana has developed very properly, are absolutely correlative with fascistization trends. And I think that the key issue here is that the temporality of this war is at the same time the temporality and configuration of new forms of, let's say, fascism. And fascism is a special relationship with war regimes, with war machines, and war as a goal, as a societal effort. And I think that this is the key issue for the question of peace now. I don't remember who it was. A participant told which kind of peace? What does it mean, peace? You also, Artemi, talk about that. And I think that the issue is, we'll see. The main thing is to stop the war clashes as soon as possible, because otherwise the very subjective and content-wise temporality of this whole process goes towards fascistization. And I think this is something we shouldn't forget, taking also into account that as long as this war goes on, the tipping points that are the background of the whole process, mostly climate, are not going to be met. And this means that a whole set of catastrophical processes are going to be triggered in a few years in terms of of drought, in terms of floodings, in terms of climate change, in terms of natural catastrophes, hunger, and so on, which at the same time are key and are absolutely ecologically best fit for fascist forms of government. I think this is the main point, and I'm finishing, about the necessity of stopping the war to gain time to build a new transnational emancipatory organization. I think I'm sorry, but I'm convinced about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I fully agree. For that reason, I would maybe even consider some kind of compromise now, right, instead of escalation. Well, of course, in a rational way, so as not to reinforce Putin, but yeah, the bad peace is better than a good war, as the Russian saying goes. And it's as you are saying, because it will gradually transform the region into the fascist or just very authoritarian, aggressive, identitarian ideology. It's mechanical, like as Arseny also said. When such a war starts and everyone becomes involved, like the population votes for it, like no matter what in any country. Because of course, and we need to. I mean, probably it was not maybe sufficiently mentioned. War. I mean, people love war because it's a source of enjoyment. It's a forbidden enjoyment, but when there is a pretext, they immediately go to war and are excited, and that's what Svetlana also mentioned. This is we have to take it as a fact, and one needs to do some psychopathy, like in this regard. But also, the best psychotherapy is peace. Some kind of recognition of opponents by the opponents. There was a lot previously to this war where we all know like who is to blame, but previously, I mean, we all understand that no one wanted to listen to anyone on both sides. Russia even gave an ultimatum before the war, which in my view, I mean, it would be better to accept this ultimatum than wage the war. But no one even took it seriously. They laughed. And also with regard to what Sandro said, that he didn't expect much to come from this region. Yeah, well, but the region is not only Russia. If it was only Russia as a like minor, relatively medium economy, okay, but it's a huge region. The post-Soviet,
Yes, but
post-socialist region.
it was a self-criticism.
Yeah, no, that's you are not alone.
I know.
You were not alone, but this reflects a certain political mentality. The reason for which you as a scholar like didn't probably anticipate this is the same reason why the politicians didn't really want to talk to Russia, because they didn't think like that was important. Interestingly, there was more emphasis in the West on the so-called post-colonial world, and post-colonial world mostly meant India or Latin America mostly, right? To a lesser extent, Africa. Africa also doesn't interest many people, and maybe the result would be the same. But there was for the last 20 years, in the last 20 years, even in the scholarly community, we felt this, like, okay, let's talk about India. Who cares about Russia? Cares about Ukraine, like Eastern Europe? Kind of it's the thing of the past. They are no longer when they were communists, they were interesting. Now, boring, weak countries. Serious mistake. and also kind of irrational, because this post-colonial theory is too centered on the former British colonies. There are other colonies in the world except for British colony.
But if I may just add to this point, I've been always wondering precisely about that. And I think, or at least how it seems now, that it wasn't so much because of some boring place and unclear place and etc., but it also was almost, I mean, like almost unconscious or very even rational sometimes choice of, there should be a bad actor in the smooth system, right? So kind of like a really terrible empire to slow down its own kind of, de-imperialization and decolonial practices. So because based on all these economic deals and etc., right? So there were so many lessons about not making deals with like some totalitarian regimes or authoritarian regimes or regimes that actually didn't overcome their imperial past and whatnot, right? So where the exploitation, so I mean, like the exploitation of Siberia and etc. wasn't it known thing, right? So it was just the open thing. It was clear, right? So why these prices and why and etc. So, and that's where, that thing, it wasn't because of not interest, because it was very useful, because it was working. And that now is a problem, because now there is no other way. So what to do now? We lost our best actor, kind of, in this assemblage. So, right, so Russia has to survive, Putin has to be satisfied, and even some calls to stop the war also have to do with this. So, and that's why my another question, right? I mean, the question of decolonization of Russia is extremely complex. And of course, there is no answer to this. But that's why my calls for solidarity and thinking today is precisely about that. Is about looking for voices, looking for places where such thinking could be made. I do not see much engagement of Russian, let's say, First Nation activists in such discussions, and there are many of them. And among this level of discussions, they are never included, never, right? So we are all considering, from all sides, what the decolonization of Russia should be. But nobody is given the space to them to speak. And things like this, right? So, I mean, Ukraine has their own things. And what really terrifies me is how many very important initiatives have been like collapsed and broken after all this entire weaponization of race that is going during this war and etc. I do not know when we are gonna kind of return to solving those issues, and we will be soaking in them for like entire century, if not longer, right? So, and but again, if I see certain emergency is again what those solidarities and those discussions and certain visions from those people who suffered them directly. Yeah,
we all, of course, one more time, we express the solidarity with the people of Ukraine who are suffering from this.
Yeah, in this moment, I speak beyond Ukraine. I actually speak about Russian First Nations and
well, the First Nations,
so,
there must be a movement of this. There is not so much of a movement right now. But this issue will now come up more and more. I agree. We are now discussing possible projects of how could Russia in the future, when there will be changes, what would be a good arrangement? Should it like decolonize itself, but like to dissolve and to reduce itself to Moscovia, I don't think so, and I don't think it is plausible. Rather, I'm thinking more of an this thing can be resolved, I think, only in the global way. If we have an international anti-war movement, if we have an international social democratic movement, then we can imagine a certain way of managing the multicultural international international space. I'm thinking of federal.
Yeah, or
Federal.
this multi-vectoral, really, right? So because you have kind of from all sides approach this, otherwise it cannot be solved, right? So and the international decisions made so many mistakes in the past, right? So how to in fact mobilize all those vectors or pay attention to all those vectors across which certain forces collided in this war. So, but this locality, so that's why I do kind of pay attention to all possible local, right? So if there is anything local, but still, right? So this kind of spaces of struggle, let's say, to notice them. How do we notice them? Because we don't even see them, because there are so many of them, and we don't even see them, to be honest. We don't even know them. But how do we know them now? Through what is happening.
Yeah,
Because
but look, for example, in terms of decolonization, the previous country, republic to be decolonizing from Russia was Chechen Republic. Is there Chechen Republic as a voice now? Yes, and we hear this voice. So it became a very right-wing enclave or like a subject. And regardless, okay, there is the leader who is bound by loyalty with Putin. That's one thing. But another thing is that this is genuinely supported, and this has been also the mood of their anti-Russian movement. At least it was split, but mostly it was a very conservative movement, the fundamentalism and all that. So we should be very careful. I mean, it's just that in the Ukrainian case, I mean, to speak a little cynically, we all support Ukraine because Ukraine is this nice, progressive, very cultured country that we all know. Think that if instead of Ukraine, there would be some less cultured and a country where we wouldn't know their literature. It would be a little more complicated, and that's more or less what we had with Chechnya. So the thing is not only about like mechanical decolonization,
but even that approach
rearrangement.
also means that we even decolonized ourselves, right? So I mean, like if we support a little more literal culture or country, it means there is a problem with us already right there, right? So what I mean, and whether we can or cannot call the case of Chechnya really decolonization, right? So it's I see the tendency, but I mean,
Sandro.
Yeah, very quickly, I mean, I agree that the question of decolonization is kind of complicated with respect to Russia, and in particular in this conjuncture of war. I am struck, of course, by the way in which people like Dugin take on the language of decoloniality. But on the other hand, there is this forum of minorities and nationalities in the Federation of Russia that meets in the European Parliament and is led by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland. And 2 days ago, they came out with a map.
I saw it, yeah.
Did you see the map? It's quite amazing. A map of a future decolonial Russia. And they also speak the language of decolonization, de-imperialization, And what they do is basically to code a certain number of minorities as nationalities that deserve to live in a nation state. So the project is a project of dissolution of the Russian Federation with the language of decolonization and de-imperialization. So it's kind of weird. It's kind of weird. What we would need is a different kind of perspective, a non-nationalist decolonial perspective, but this is not available, it seems, right now.
Yeah, we need a language. We definitely need a language because we see that this form of empire is also not the one that was kind of mostly discussed in the imperial studies, right? So the empires with outside colonies, right? So this is empire with the colonies inside or just right outside of the
Yeah, it was
border.
more interesting. The so-called internal colonization took place. There is a good
Yeah,
book
but
by
even
Alexander
that
Etkin
term
on
is a
this.
little
Italy is a
problematic,
good
right?
example
Because
of that,
yeah, so, and that's why we are lacking conceptual framework to even approach.
Want to elaborate a global language. I'm not sure that everything is so great with it, even in English. But yeah, the Russian situation has its own specifics. I must say that again, it's very important that we have this intellectual community, which ultimately means that there is something like I don't know, the West in the good sense, a community that represents the left or even broadly liberal, democratically oriented public, because this is not the case everywhere. We are having a resurgence of very right-wing forces there, and the forces that respond to the hubris of civilization with a certain brutality. This is a big danger. So even though we understand why, we should hold to a certain civilization, I think. That's the perspective of an Eastern European intellectual. You know, the Eastern European intellectuals, we are those who believe in the West. We are the last people. The West doesn't believe in itself. The West thinks it doesn't exist. But from outside, I can assure you. That's why I am now in the West. But we should be smarter, and we should have a universal project. Okay, and also as a concluding remark, we will look into the possibilities of maybe transcribing this creatively, changing and editing and publishing it. So be aware of this. We will contact you. And there will be a recording, which we will probably put on the website of our new institute. So this is the first event of this new institute we are creating, and Timur, who just spoke, is part of this. We will probably have new events, and one of the plans is to discuss the possible projects of federalization, of new global federalization. Thanks so much for your attention. Sorry we went too long, but I think it was worth it. A great event. Well, hopefully it will have some, at least, intellectual consequences. Right now, you know, the cannons are louder than the voices, but hopefully the voices will prevail. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right, thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.